You made it, Joe. Grab a seat. Welcome. Okay, we'll start the ball rolling. I think we're ready. I'd like to welcome to today's meeting of the Environment and Transport Overview Scrutiny Committee. It's the first of 2019. Let's hope for a positive, exciting, good year. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council's website and will also be available for viewing after the meeting. Can everyone please switch their microphones on when speaking and then turn them off when you've finished speaking? We've got apologies, so Mrs. Fry is substituting for Mrs. Richards and Mr. Parton will be substituting for Mrs. Seaton. Okay, thank you. And make sure your telephones are off and we can get the ball rolling. Item number 1, I propose that the minutes of the meeting held on November the 8th, 2018 are taken as read. Agreed. Thank you very much. So we'll sign those later. That's confirmed and I'll sign them. Point 2, we now move to item 2, question time. I have received no questions. We go to item 3. We now move to item 3. We have received a question from Mr. Hunt under Standing Order 7 in paragraph 3 and 7 paragraph 5. Max, you happy with that?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is an important item linking public health and the work of this committee, so I thought it was important that the committee heard from the officers on how they're going to deal with the report. Thank you very much.
Anne, would you like to just a quick response to that, because we did talk about it in briefing. It was short and sweet. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We'll be bringing a report to our March Scrutiny Committee for consideration.
Just to say, I think it's very valuable that we do have questions put forward, and from all members here, and they are taken seriously, and we do appreciate them. And I think that's very important for scrutiny that we do get questions, and it gives the officers opportunity to research and give us feedback. So thank you, Max, for that. We now go on to item 4, urgent items. I haven't received any notification of urgent items. We go on to item 5, declarations of interest in respect to items on the agenda. Does any member have an interest that they wish to declare? Thank you. We now move to item 6, declaration of the party whip, accordance with the overview and scrutiny procedure rule 16. Do any members have any declarations? We move to 7, item 7, presentations of petitions under Standing Order 36. There are no petitions. We now move on to item 8. This is the medium-term financial strategy. So we have Byron Rhodes, Deputy, and this is his brief, and he's very good at it. So members, you should have a copy. Now, the copy we're giving you, this buff copy, what I like about it is it puts in order so we can follow the items as we go through them, and you can ask questions. And I do suggest that ask the question after each item, not at the end, because it'll be easier so we don't get confused. Are we happy with that? Okay, fantastic. So we'll move on. Just to inform, Byron's here. Christine Radford is a support member. We'd just like to welcome Christine on this agenda item, and will also be involved. But I also have apologies from Blake, who is absent at the moment. He's away on somewhere abroad, so he's away at the moment. So we'd like to move forward over to Byron.
Yes, Chairman. Very, very good to be in front of you today. Yes, my colleague Blake Payne is away at the moment. Has asked me to stand in for him at this meeting. What I would like to do is very briefly introduce the issues around the MTFS and the challenges that the County Council is facing. We continue to be under pressure on our budgets overall. This year we have lost £8.5 million. Well, next year we shall lose £8.5 million of rate support grant, which brings us down to 0. And of course we have inflation pressures as well as rising demand. In this particular area of the budget, is really sits slightly down from our overall priorities as a county council, because we put our first priority to provide sufficient resources for the caring services, adult social care, children's social care. And environment and transportation then falls just below that level. But we do, of course, have to maintain a good and sustainable service, even though we're on very, very tight budgets. Now, over the years, we've saved considerable sums of money in this field, and the director will probably explain some of that. But now things are getting to be very, very tight. Whilst I think there's sufficient money in the budget for roads maintenance, that's dealing reactively with problems which come about, we're finding it increasingly difficult to manage manage road improvements, and indeed in future infrastructure improvements we have major problems in financing all our infrastructure improvements. So we have a deficiency in over the 4 years currently in our capital budget. Not only that, we are finding additional pressures on the transportation side, particularly with the increases in costs in public transport and the diminishing number of people using the subsidised transport, which creates difficulties, and most especially in the rise in the number of children looking for assistance in getting to and from schools, particularly those with special educational needs and disabilities. And those numbers, of course, mean that the bills on the SEN transport side of the budget are rising significantly. So it's becoming very, very difficult for officers, as they will explain, and as you'll see as we go through the proposals, to stay ahead of requirements and to satisfy the public that we're doing everything that they would wish. But that's the task we have to do, and it won't be until 2020 when there's a reset in the in local government finance, and we hope the county councils will start to get slightly bigger share of overall allocation of money for local government than they do at present, and that then should start to improve the resources available. But until that happens, and if that happens, because we still have no exact visibility of what the new system is going to actually deliver, then we have to plan for the worst case, which in this case, by the way, overall means that we're still expecting that the resources year on year will continue to fall. If they don't, then we'll be in a better position than is being put forward this afternoon. But what we're putting forward to you this afternoon is a realistic picture. I think I'll hand over to the director now to put a little bit more flesh on those bones or structure of the position.
Thank you, Byron. Over to Anne.
Thank you very much, Chair. The report sets out the implications for environment and transport over this new medium-term financial strategy period up to 2022-23. You'll see from the introduction there, the department's already saved 42 million since 2010-11, not an insubstantial figure. So, you know, I'm sure you appreciate this gets harder all the time, given the demands on the services we still have to provide. In view of that, however, moving forward, we're not significantly looking at service reduction. We have an increasing number of strategic projects linked to growth, and Mr. Rose has already alluded to the improvement in terms of some of the major infrastructure delivery and funding coming through government. Well, that's all really good news for us. Again, as Mr. Rose has said, there is requirements for us in terms of match funding for those, in development work that is not insubstantial, and that is becoming a real challenge for us. There's also, and I'm sure you'll know from your post bags, an increasing pressure on business as usual services. we're challenged to make that balance, you know, depending on community needs out there and expectations. We are then, rather than focusing on service reductions, we are looking at partnerships, how we can deliver differently. An example of that being Midlands Connect. How can they help us deliver some of the infrastructure requirements that, you know, we as a county would want to see? How do we better enable communities in doing more for themselves? And how do we make sure in what we're delivering, and when we do spend increasingly scarce resources, that they're more resilient services? An example of that being our LED for street lighting. You know, in doing that, we're providing the service, but actually in that mechanism, we have significant revenue savings year on year through our energy costs. So it's about making sure we're smart in how we deliver those type of business as usual services. That goes through the same principle applies to our waste contracts. Things like initiatives like bringing forward a new waste transfer station. That in itself allows us to drive down ongoing revenue costs over the next few decades. So, you know, it's about really being smart in how we are targeting that expenditure. And running across all that, as ever, I have got a real pressure on the service in terms of looking at efficiencies in everything we do. You know, is there a better way to do it? Can we do it more efficiently? Other implications I would want to highlight, just that really does affect the department and quite a number of areas of the department, is the increasing difficulties we're experiencing in recruitment and retention. There is a buoyant market out there. We're finding certain disciplines, posts, services very difficult to recruit to and to retain. Now that comes from the likes of, there's a really buoyant developer market out there. We've got things like HS2 looking for an awful lot of the same skills that we need. Highways England, their new budget window announced last year was, the last budget in autumn last year, 25 billion. They have massive programs to deliver and they're competing for the same skills that we need. So it is an ongoing challenge for us to recruit and retain. If we have to bring in agency or consultants, it costs us a premium. So that's another factor in terms of the ability of what we can deliver at the end of the day, because in that fixed budget envelope we've got. So just to set the scene, I'll stop there on that section, Chair.
Okay, so can we have some questions? We'll do it in the order then from service transformation. That's the discussion. So, and that is page 13 to 14, paragraphs 5 to 7. Any questions? Max, over to you.
Let's move on further. Looking at the budget, I felt perhaps this is a question particularly to Mr. Rhodes, that we've been given a substantial increase on the prior year's budget, although it might have altered during the year, accept that, and following years. And at the same time, we're being asked to pay, I think, another 4% in council tax. Now, I appreciate all the pressures, and I talk about them regularly to my residents in Loughborough, on social care and children and significant costs for the authority in the light of the cuts made by government year on year to local government, which have been harsh. So what I could conclude from the report are two main things, really, apart from which I would like the Pelican Crossing on Old Ashby Road, please. Yeah. Since Mr. Rose has been so kind to us all. The two matters are, first of all, the SEN transport. And I appreciate this is going on to the detail, so I'll just sketch it out now. Yeah. And the question is, and it can be asked now or later when we get to that page, is, you know, why are we forcing costs down and bringing costs up with this growth item? And it indicates we haven't got the control over that item that we were promised if we accepted the very harsh cuts in the service in the middle of last year. And this second issue, which I think we'll come to when we get there. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
We'll carry on because you can answer this in the next phase. So we'll go on to the next page. Is that all right, Max, with you? Because you've jumped a bit, but that's I understand why. So proposed revenue budget transfers and adjustments.
Thank you. Yes, looking at paragraphs 8 onwards there, you see the overview for the revenue situation for the department. This current year coming, 66.9 million, just under 67 million, and that's at 68 million by 2022-23. Table 2 breaks that down in a bit more detail for you, albeit I know not an awful lot of detail, but actually breaks it down for you. The thing I would emphasise there that that's a net cost. The overall expenditure we have on revenue is 109 million. So while you see there some of the big expenditure items like transport operations, so that's our SEN transport, concessionary fares, home to school transport, those budgets, and further down the 24 million, which is a large part are waste disposal costs there. While you look at highways delivery at 8 million, actually that is a net cost. We spend several times more than that on the highways, but at the end of the day, when we get income in, recharge to capital, etc., that's a net expenditure. So just to set that out for you in a bit more context there. I think that's all we're covering in this section. We obviously go into a wee bit more detail through the rest of the report, but I'll stop there in case there's any high-level questions.
Okay, any questions on those paragraphs and pages? Okay. Let's move on to growth. This is paragraph 16, pages 15 to 16.
Thank you. Yeah, as you'll see, what we're setting out by the end of the MTFS period is an additional requirement of growth of 5.2 million per annum. The key factors, there are a couple of key factors in that we've highlighted for you, are the SEN transport. Now, I'm sure you'll be familiar with this because it is an ongoing theme year on year. We see increasing growth every year on this one. We do build growth into the budget every year, and every year without fail it exceeds this. The cost we have to meet, because it's about demand responsive cost, we have a statutory duty to meet these costs, it exceeds that. Key reasons are, one, we're seeing increasing complexity of cases, in which case there, for instance, it may mean we need solo transport rather than, perhaps carrying individuals on fleet transport, etc. So that hikes up the cost, as well as perhaps increasing medical needs, so it needs an escort or medically trained escort with them. So again, that adds to the cost. And then that is compounded by we are actually consistently seeing more numbers coming through the system. So again, as I say, I'm sure that one's not new to you, but is an ongoing theme, and we aren't seeing any reduction in that at all. We're seeing continued growth. The other items to highlight for you under the growth budget is the 800,000 there under G16. Now that's split into two aspects. The first is 400,000, which I'm sure you recall because you had a report not too long ago about setting up a team to resource our work to represent the council in the HS2 development, which will be coming through the county over the next decade and a half, and that is that 400,000 allocated to that. The other 400,000 is dealing with forestry and ash dieback, and it's about getting ourselves in a position that we are minimising the risk to the county from, we know ash dieback is here, how we deal with that and how we deal with our wider forestry matters. I think over and above that, though, it's set in context, and I think perhaps this comes into Mr. Hunt's earlier question here, some of the other factors that are increasing pressure on the department. The overall demand responsive element applies equally to waste as it does to the likes of SEN transport, because obviously if there's most waste produced, we are duty bound to deal with that. So, we just have to react to that demand and whatever the cost is. Obviously our challenge is in dealing with those volumes, we're managing it in the best way to reduce the costs. In terms of highways, and I know we've had a bit of debate about this earlier, yes, we have reducing allocations to highways, and we have a changing picture in how we are managing our highway network, and we've had separate reports to this committee on that. However, it is predicated on, everything's wonderful in the garden if it's predicated on the base amount of funding we've got sufficient to deal with the fabric of our network to make sure we're maintaining reasonable standards? What I would say is it's not, and we're beginning to see that in our performance data in terms of not the A-class roads, but the unclassifieds in particular, if I can even say it, particular, this year is the first year we've now seen an increase in the percentage of the network of the unclassifieds which need structural maintenance to them. So we're beginning, hopefully it might just be a blip and it's not the start of the long-term trend, but if I were to put any money on it, we'd probably say it is going to be the start of a bit more of a trend. We're going to see a deterioration in the base condition of our network, and our ability to respond to that is, limited. So I would factor that one in. The other one, increasing demand, is, and again, members will be fully aware, public expectations of what we deliver for them. Society changes all the time, expectations change all the time, and it's challenging to meet those in an awful lot of cases. Inflation, inflation rates means, and particularly construction inflation, which is high because we have that buoyant development market, means that we have less purchasing power. So we can buy less materials, and it means at the end of the day we're delivering less on the ground. Even if we've got the same budget, our purchasing power is reduced. And the last one I would mention is we've got population growth. The whole country's got population growth. You're probably aware we've got significant growth plans through the Leicester and Leicestershire Strategic Growth Plan out to 2050. And what that means is more people using the roads, more people generating waste that we have to deal with, as well as higher expectations. So that compounds to put increasing demand overall on our budgets and our services. Right, I'm going to stop there.
Any questions? Bill.
Yes, Chair. Page 17, ET1.
We're not there yet.
Aren't you there yet?
Yep.
I thought we were.
No.
In that case, I shall reserve that for future.
I'll forgive you this time. Max, sorry, and then David.
We are on growth, and excuse me for flipping to page 29, but it is the item staffing and admin in the highways and transportation budget, which is the one that stands out and is not actually in the growth because it's presumably some sort of secular increase, which is not exceptional. But it is a significant increase, I think £500,000, something like that, as the first item on that table on page 29. I just wondered if you could have an explanation for that. Because when I tell my residents that we're spending an extra £500,000 on staff in County Hall, they won't be happy.
Would that be the HO2 staff? Partly? Yeah, I thought you'd... Okay, would you cover that quickly?
Okay, just quickly. Partly it's the HS2 that we've just mentioned there, but partly the area we're seeing significant growth in is in our major projects. Now, you'll be aware we're delivering Melton Distributor Road, which is a £65 million scheme. We will be starting this year the Junction 23 A512 scheme at Loughborough, which is a £25-ish million scheme, etc. We've got a number of other ones coming through the pipeline. We've also got some major bids in the pipeline. Now, bear in mind, things like the business case for Melton cost us £4 million. There is loads of work in developing up the business case for bids. We've got, which you're aware, a couple of housing infrastructure fund bids, which will bring projects into the total value of around about 100 million. Those teams need to have had to expand in order to be able to be in a position to bid for the money and then deliver those projects. So actually the capital programme we've got, if we're successful in those bids, we're looking at a capital programme of about £1/3 billion. I don't think we've ever had a capital programme that big. You'll be able to tell me, but to my knowledge, I don't think we have. It's about the resources that need. So that's a growth area that we've had to expand in, which will contribute to that increase in staffing and admin costs you're seeing there.
Does that help, Max?
It does help me, and I think it helps everybody really to know that staff and admin doesn't mean anything as insignificant perhaps as that to most people. It means these big projects that you're running, of which we're very proud. So perhaps it's a question of presentation. I shouldn't say this to you, should I? But Mr. Rhodes is very good at presentation, so he'll no doubt cover this. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Any other questions on those paragraphs? Let's go on to savings, highways and transport. Oh, sorry, David, I missed you.
Just coming on growth.
it goes against the grain for me to question a railway project, but HS2, it might or might not be coming. But what intrigues me is we talk here about the opportunities available. Now, obviously, the problem for Leicestershire is, of course, that the line, if it's built, will go straight through Leicestershire. And although we can argue that there should be better connections to Birmingham and Towton, which I think are the nearest stations, I do wonder what the other opportunities are going to be available to us. I can understand minimising impact to the communities, but could we have a report at some point so that we could have some indication of what these opportunities are?
Anne, that's a straight question. I know we discussed it prior that it's although the line's going through, it is the building of the track, the infrastructure, a lot of services provision. People need somewhere to stay. Some people will move here to work on the projects, etc. But it would be, I think, a bit more clear if we just make a list and potentially for the next meeting or have something available so we can present this and we know clearly the areas of impact and how we're going to benefit from that. And I think that's fair enough, I think. Are you okay with that?
I mean, fine. I'm happy to answer now. If you'd rather have a report, that's fine. I mean, I think
how would you like it, David?
Fairly, succinct answer at the moment.
If we can get an answer now, that'd be fine. Yeah.
Okay, and go for it, Anne. Yep.
Certainly. Now, the first one of those, I think, opportunities available in addition to the ones you've already highlighted, is the likes of the classic compatible link. Now, you'll be aware from the County Council's position on HS2, which has been through Cabinet, etc. One of the criteria was on the basis that we achieved a classic compatible link, which in effect that is shorthand for the Midland Main Line has an access point onto the HS2 network. Now, where we want that is north of Leicester, so you come up the Midland Main Line through Leicester, and then you have the ability for those trains to connect onto the HS2 network. What that does is that gives Leicester direct access to northern cities such as Leeds, which it hasn't now. If like me, in trying to get to Scotland sometimes by rail, you cannot do anything direct, would be brilliant. You would see significant improvements to the network, and that brings economic growth. And we did have a report as part of our support of the rail strategy that detailed the amount of GVA we'd expect from that. Other opportunities are the likes of, Chair, as you've alluded to, in terms of constructing this, they will be literally hundreds, thousands, I won't quote exact numbers, but there will be a lot of workers coming in. There will be a lot of investment for business, and it's about maximising those opportunities as they come along. So that it's really about taking those economic benefits, and while this is happening, if it's happening across the county, we are not losing out, we are maximising it to it. And the other side of it is, you're absolutely right, it's about minimising those impacts on the communities, the severance, the noise, the visual impact, everything from the physical stuff to the actual construction is about looking at those things. But the main opportunities are about improved rail services and the economic benefit that can bring to our local economies, as well as during the construction, the whole economic benefit and the investment that will potentially bring into the county. It's about grabbing that and maximising it, and that's what that focus will be on.
I understand.
Yes, David.
I understand the arguments about compatibility and all the rest of it, but of course, this authority is not in a position to invest in the capital, the capital that will be required to do that. All this authority can do is argue for this to happen, and hope that somebody takes notice, just as they've took notice of the need for electrification of the Midland Main Line. In other words, I hope we're not going to spend all this money on opportunities just arguing and just producing glossy reports in the hope that somebody reads them, and that because the cupboards in this place must be full of glossy reports which never went anywhere. It's just a thought. I'd rather actually spent money on something tangible that's actually going to be there on the ground that we can all see and use.
I understand your argument, David, before I go to Byron, but unfortunately, if we sit back, all of us here, we're in a catch-22 situation. If we don't do anything, and I do nothing, and we're not prepared, then we lose out. If we get prepared, and then let's be straight. If it doesn't happen, we lose out. So I'd rather be in a situation where we're prepared, to be honest, to benefit. And I'm sure not many people would vote against that. I think we have to be prepared. It is some risk. I'm the first one to admit that, but I do feel I'd rather be prepared than not prepared, and then look silly when we've lost great opportunity. Byron.
Yes, I think you need to look at the totality of growth and what eventually will have the impact on our budgets, because we are looking in this item at the money side and not just at all the detailed side of priorities within the schemes we might or may not follow within highways. Little comments being made about the SEN pressures, but I mean they amount to something like another £2 million on our budgets within the 4 years. That's a massive increase in requirement. And then you've got the 400,000, which has just been spoken about on HS2. Well, whilst a lot of the effort will enable the county as a whole and businesses to prosper and to take advantage from the fact that this major project going through Leicestershire, over 40 odd miles of railway going to be carved right through the county. There's a downside to it. The downside is the disruption, and inevitably you do get some when you're putting in such a major project, and that could involve road closures. It could require all sorts of traffic hold-ups while work is going on. Now, what we have to do is make sure that we have the capability of managing those things in the scheme as it goes along, in which case we have to be very close to the project and ensure to be able to plan for when these things are going to happen. It may be we have to spend money to prevent an adverse impact from the disruption. So an extra £400,000 a year for that is a very significant extra burden, which a year ago we didn't expect to have to carry, but now we do. And then you add this ash dieback issue, which is going to change the landscape of Leicestershire quite considerably. And it's only just begun in Leicestershire. There are a few trees infected, and it's not yet taken hold, but we know it's taken hold elsewhere in the country, so we know that this is coming, and no one at the moment knows how to hold it back. So if it does come, we are going to have to deal with an immense problem of removing these diseased trees and dealing with them. Some of them, of course, will be on private land, and that'll be for those landowners to manage, but some of them will be close to the highway, and we'll have to make sure that we don't run any risks of diseased trees falling onto the highway or so on. So it all adds up to about another 2.8 million additional costs. And I think you have to realise and have that in the back of your mind when we start to talk about the savings, because effectively it's 2.8 million that's been added to our savings programme.
Thank you, Byron. James.
Thank you, Chair. Just really, if I come back briefly to the HS2 question that's been raised, I think classic connectivity is what it's all about for Leicestershire. I think if I'm right in saying HS2 would take about an hour to get from Birmingham to Towton to London. Where we get the fast train, you can get that from Leicester already. So knocking 5 minutes off our journey time to London isn't, for me, what HS2 is about. It's opportunities northwards, as you say, up to Yorkshire, and honestly further north than that in due course, Scotland, absolutely. So so completely on board with Dad and what you're saying on that. I was just interested to what you were saying in terms of how it was going to connect up, the ideas at this stage north of Leicester, joining up with HS2 at that point. Would this be a long track that already exists the old Burton line or something similar, or would this be new build, new ley land? And if so, I mean, I'm not a rail expert, but it would strike me as logic to do that north of Loughborough, because then you get Loughborough as well, and you're closer geographically to the route of the HS2. So I was just interested anyway to see what the thoughts were on that.
Over to you, Anne, but thank you, James. Good question.
My understanding at the moment is it's a new bit of track from the existing main line to connect into, the new HS2. And, I think they would look to take it from the existing junction. I can't remember, up at Trent, Ratcliffe on Trent Way, somewhere up there is what we're looking at. But new construction to link that into the new HS2 line itself. Obviously, there's loads of detail to be worked out. At the moment, as we understand it, there's passive provision for it. Now, that means they're not doing anything that could preclude the construction of it. But at the moment, it doesn't include for the construction as part of the hybrid bill. We would be looked to, seek to change that situation.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Anne. We'll move on to paragraph 17, pages 33, 17, 18, and Appendix C, page 33, saving highways and transport.
Okay. Savings, for under highways and transport, as you'll see there, the savings rise to 2.6 million per annum to the end of the MTFS period. I'll briefly talk you through each of these. The first one, the revised passenger transport policy, you will be aware of because, again, several reports have been brought to this committee on that. And that is as under the new policy that was agreed by Cabinet in October, we will be revising our existing subsidised buses to see which ones best fit that criteria and offer, under those new criteria, offer good value for money. For the services that, offer poorer value for money, we will be looking to work with the communities to provide an alternative form of transport, most likely something like demand responsive transport, but we will be working with the communities on that. And as you'll see, the saving on that is 400,000. That work is now ongoing in terms of reviewing the existing services to the new criteria, and we will then beginning to work with the communities. We have an officer in place to take that forward. The next one is the social care in SEN transport, and again, various reports have been to this committee on that one, and is implementing from this new academic year, as in September 2019, new transport provision for predominantly SEN and mainstream post-16 transport. As I say, that will be implemented from the academic year in September. The next one, review of staff absence. This is something that is applied corporately across each of the departments, so it's a reduction by managing absence. We have a very proactive programme within Environment and Transport to manage staff absence, so there's various triggers and various processes that are taken through, and we also have benefited from a corporate HR initiative of intensive support in a number of areas, particularly in our highways operational side, our passenger fleet and our recycling and household waste centres. So in the more manual front-facing services, we've had some real high-intensity project work there, and that's where we're looking to take that savings by reducing the amount of absence that the department has. The alternative fleet provision, 200,000, that one there is looking at our most expensive transport contracts, SEN, transport contracts that we have, and bringing them in-house. So what we have done is we have procured the fleet, we have taken on drivers, etc. And the first ones began operating last October. More were rolling out from January, and we'll be reviewing how that goes. So we're starting with the 10 most expensive contracts, bringing them in-house, and we envisage this level of service. But it's something that we keep on the radar because, if we feel there's further opportunity from it, it may be something we want to expand and build on. The next one, revenue savings from capital programme. This reflects actual capital works we were doing at our depot down in Croft, and from that it means we're more efficient in some of our revenue practices, namely in our fleet, so we can get more throughput of vehicles through our workshop, we can do more MOTs, etc. So it has a revenue saving from us from that investment in capital. That's the key things to highlight under highways and transport, so I'll stop there before we come on to environment and waste.
Hilary, question, thank you. And
Thank you very much. My question really was to do with the review of staff absence, and I'm very delighted to hear that you've got proactive things and looking at it very closely. We say that the target is 7.5 days per full-time employee. What are we at the moment, and how do we compare with, like, are we above the national average? I know FT is, where are we in the level with other like-minded councils or like councils?
I'll be able to answer some of that, but sorry, I'm not an expert maybe across the board, and so I'll do my best on that. We as a department, the latest figures that I have had, so I get them on a quarterly basis. In fact, actually, I get them on a monthly basis. So it's not about a year end thing or anything, is just under 10, 9.96 or 9.98 across the department, okay? Corporately, I think we're round about, and somebody else might be able to remember as well, I think we're round about 10, no, corporate for the whole of LCC corporately. So we're not far off the LCC average. However, the interesting thing is when you divide it down by individual services and teams, we have anything from 15 down to 3. Now, where you get the 15s is more often the likes of the highway operatives. They're out there all the time. They're doing more physical work than you and I. I sit behind a desk. Do you know, so absence is higher. And that's reflected in as well. For our department, we're different from the corporate in terms of our highest reason for absence is musculoskeletal. You know, so it's all your back things, your neck things, that kind of thing, because that reflects that. So we are looking at some of our initiatives are about targeting. For instance, we've looked at a specific physio, if some kind of specific physio offer would particularly help areas. So we're trying to target as well, what's needed in certain areas. Your wider question in terms of nationally I'm not too sure, to be honest, on other local authorities, but I do know that in terms of local government, the public sector, we are higher traditionally than the private sector. What you've got to remember is many private sector operations don't get sick pay. For instance, direct example we've got in Joe's area is recycling and household waste sites. We took those in, 18 months ago. The operator that had that before didn't pay sick pay. We do. We saw the absence go up. But we're dealing with that. But you're not comparing apples and apples when you're looking at other sectors. Apologies for not having the kind of wider public sector figure.
Thank you, Hilary. Bill.
Yes, Chair. Page 17. We'll have a go at this one now. ET1. Have we got a definition of essential? It says essential needs as undefined in 1985 Transport Act. Have we got a cast iron definition of essential before we get legally challenged on that by somebody?
It's I'm not quite sure about cast iron. However, as part of the policy we have put through, which came to this committee and went to cabinet, we have our criteria that defines how we are assessing it. So in terms of, yes, we have our interpretation of what essential means, because as ever, we often find the case, unfortunately, legislation doesn't help us. It just gives us the terms, but it doesn't give us the definition. We have, in terms of this policy, interpreted that for LCC, and that is the criteria. It comprises things like, access to medical facilities, to food shopping. There's a number of criteria that we've interpreted as, so that is embedded in our policy. So in terms of that, I would say, yes, we have a definition of it. I wouldn't like to legally say whether that was cast iron or not, because somebody will challenge something along the line, but we have interpreted it for LCC, yes.
were quite strict on some of the criteria, what was used. Are we going to review that policy after it's been in for 12 months so we can see how people have been affected? We are talking about the most disadvantaged people in society, and I hate this county council to go down a policy that's going to affect them. We're not even considering their views after it's been in. Okay, there's a lot of uproar at the moment when it gets implemented. I expect that, but we need to listen to what people have to say. Some of their difficulties they're having, we need to listen to that, and if need be brave enough to review the policy to fit in with what we can help those people with.
I think I would say we're always open to review. You know, if we're implementing something and finding for whatever reason it is not working, obviously we would want to review that. I would say that first and foremost. The second thing I would say about this is, and again, as we discussed at this committee, we have got an exceptions policy on that. So it's entirely, if for whatever reason a family finds they cannot comply, it's not working for them, they don't feel it'll work, or whatever reason, there is an appeals process for exceptions. And as part of the budget saving in here, normally we would allocate something like 10% for exceptions and expect round about that, but actually we allocated 20% in the knowledge that this will be challenging. It's new for people. We are asking for something different from, you know, the way transport has been provided before, and we anticipate therefore there will be a number of challenges in implementing it and seeing that through, and in some instances it just won't work. So we are actually, we have geared up thinking there will be some exceptions, because I absolutely agree, it doesn't matter what your policy is, you know, very rarely can you implement it 100% and stick to your policy. There will always be, for some reason, there'll need to be an exception. So we have tried to build that into this policy. But on the wider premise, yes, I would say we're always open to review if for whatever reason we have enough evidence to say something is just not working and it's not achieving the objectives that we need in the community or the users of that service need.
I'm sure they will, but I guess a scrutiny, if we get information and through the reporting through the year, if necessary, it can be brought up, and I'm sure it could be aired when necessary, because as you said, it is the people at risk. And I know the department are very keen to get it right, but I do hear what you're saying, and I think we need to keep an eye on it.
Chair, unless Mr. Stack makes a note of it, it's likely to get missed out in the 12 months after it's been implemented. If Mr. Stack makes a note of it, it's down in writing.
I'm sure we can make a note of it. No, thank you.
Thank you.
And then, sorry.
Yes, Chairman. ET1 and ET2 are the two items that cause me the concern on this report. Not for the first time. To take ET1. Just, I think, about a month or 2 months ago, there was a move to remove the service 159 from Colville to Hinckley, and this serves places along the way, Newbold, Verdon and Stapleton, for example. And it was agreed to keep this service going. Now, I hope we're not getting into a position where, by voting for this, we remove the budget for that service and it disappears. Because if there is a threat to that, then obviously I can't see how I can support this particular cut. I share Bill's views on the SEN transport, incidentally, as well. But I think we do need assurances. Well, I would like an assurance that after June, when that's going to be reviewed, it's not simply lost because of a decision that's being taken here this afternoon and by Cabinet.
Okay, it does say, I thought this was already policy, we'd already discussed it. So we've gone in depth with this. I'll come to James in a second, but James, sorry, Paul, sorry. So point taken, but let's go to Paul.
Thank you. It was just to highlight that this isn't the only authority that's had this decision to make. And there's good practice in other parts of the country. And I believe it's Moray in Scotland that the public have been very supportive, perhaps reticent to begin with, but once it's been implemented, that a demand-led service of public transport has worked really well. That's a very disparate and diverse long distances in that area. So if it can work there, I'm sure we all have communities that are concerned. I certainly have communities that are concerned. There's a policy that has been passed by the Cabinet, so it's policy, it's not a decision here. And I would wait to see with some keen eyes how it develops. But I have some degree of reassurance. I'll have to try and convince some parts of my division of that, but of the essential needs, because I can see where that would be. And I think in every community we can see where that would be. So, thank you.
Okay. And I do think David's got a point as well. We have to be, there is isolation, this is not even this country, it's all over the world now where local services, bus services in particular, are not being used. How do you fund them? I was watching a TV programme on the other side of the world, they go, well, we've got one passenger per trip. How can we afford to keep it going? It's not using the money. So they are looking at very new ways. Demand response, they had, I think, some other names, local community buses. I think we have to be very clever and smart. So we look after the residents, we prevent isolation, but at the same time, spend money wisely. I don't think anybody disagree with that. Any other questions on that? Over back to you, David.
Could I be recorded as having put in a plea for that service, which has been reinstated, and just to ensure that it's not going to be swept aside by the decision that could be taken today or by the Cabinet?
Just make can we make a note, or it's policy, is it, Ian? Or
sorry, can I just clarify, actually, that service will be subject to the same process as every other subsidised service, and that is exactly why the policy has been put in place with those criteria. There will be no exceptions to that. We have to treat every service the same in terms of reviewing it under the criteria that the Cabinet has approved.
Is that all right, David? It's part of.
This, I think I better have my name recorded as having concerns, if you like, or objecting to that particular item.
We'll do that. Look, I think from Melton, the same. I think there's a number of people here in the same situation with services. I'm sure Byron's the same from where you live as well, Byron.
Let's make a comment, because of the comparison with Moray. I mean, it's interesting that councils in Scotland are able to do this sort of thing, because they're all unitary councils in Scotland, you know. There's a thought.
1996, they all went unitary.
Very small ones, Byron, I gather, as well. Very small unitary ones. Okay, we'll move on to the next point. Savings in the environment and waste. Anne.
Okay, report.
18 and I think it's Appendix 33.
Sorry, I've turned my microphone on. Page 18. That first one, the revised payment mechanism for recycling credits. This is a full year impact for that recycling credits. That in totality, 3.4 million. Some of those authorities involved, because of their existing contractual arrangements, they came on line at different times. So this is about seeing that full year effect of that mechanism. The second one, recycling and household waste site service approach. This is a wider service review looking at three aspects under recycling and household waste. One, considering a commissioning approach for Whetstone site. You're aware that's one of our big sites there. The second aspect is looking at how we could potentially increase reuse and income from reuse across all the sites. And the third one is our overall approach to operating those sites. Although what I would emphasise to that, and want you all to hear, we are not considering any kind of site closures. So we're looking at, there's 14 sites there. There will still be 14 sites at the end of that process. The next one is trade waste income. So that's about optimising, those charges for trade waste. It's finally balancing that consideration to ensure we're maximising income, but obviously dealing with the trade waste and getting the volumes coming through that we want coming through. Future residual waste strategy, that is about our procurements for our waste streams and driving efficiencies through that, through those procurement arrangements. And we've got a number of fairly sizable ones coming up over the next 2-3 years. So that's about savings we'd anticipate through that process. And the last one there, green and wood waste contracts, that's about tonnages changing, being lower than thought we'd actually anticipated having, and gate prices, lower gate prices than we'd anticipated on both those streams there. So that's in effect what we would envisage being able to achieve through those two particular streams of waste. I'll take any questions, and Jill will be happy to answer, I'm sure, as well.
Max, over to you.
Just a quick point. I like the idea of increasing levels of reuse, particularly SR sites, and I think that's imaginative and something we probably want to hear of in the future. Along with any, largely this depends upon national legislation, I would say, but the duty to repair is another interesting facet of that.
Thank you, Max. Dave?
Residual waste. Up to now, we've been paying an increasing amount of tax on every tonnage, every ton that's disposed of as residual waste. And it's I don't know whether we still have to pay that amount. Could you just remind us, is that imposed upon us by the UK government, or is that a EU directive, or what? Then I'll
HM Treasury.
This is an internal tax, nothing to do with the
National
EU.
Government.
Nothing to do with the EU.
Treasury.
Right. Are we making any representation to be relieved of the necessity? I mean, I can't understand the justice of being punished effectively for having to dispose of waste when authorities such as this make every effort that we possibly can to recycle and reduce, and yet we still have this punitive tax, which I think has been steadily increasing over the years. Now, what are we doing? Are we just giving into it, or are we saying something? Or
through you, Chair. Landfill tax has been around for a long time, and yes, it's a substantial cost per tonne. If you think about disposal of a tonne of waste to landfill, we'll pay upwards of £100 a tonne, and 80-something pounds of that is tax, 87, I think. It's a substantial amount, is taxation that goes straight to the Treasury. The environmental benefit of that, though it is a tax from government, is that landfill is the worst form of disposal. It has the biggest environmental impact. There's leachate, there's landfill gas, there's no way of recovering anything from it. So the tax was a blunt tool to force a whole-scale change in the way the districts collect waste and we dispose of it. And we've had to comply with that, originally to do with the EU landfill directive, though that's slightly changed. All I would add to that is I think there's very little point in us trying to lobby to change it because it's such an embedded tax, though I think that it will be interesting to see with the new National Resources and Waste Strategy, there's an acceptance that central government is ultimately getting less and less from that form of taxation because less and less waste is going to landfill, so it's actually a dwindling income source to the Treasury. And the one that I would be more concerned, and I don't have the answers today for this scrutiny, but it's one that officers are watching, is that government have alluded and muted the point that if things don't continue to go in the right direction in terms of driving waste out of landfill and incineration in the long term, they will consider an incineration tax. So it's actually an interesting thing that there's a shifting position in terms of those fiscal measures around waste. But at their core, they are pushing waste up the hierarchy, which has recoverable benefits and has value from things like reuse and recycling. It has a value, those materials.
Thank you, Joe. That was very clear. Byron?
I'd just like to remind Mr. Bill that this policy was developed over the period of the coalition government when Sir Edward Davey was the Secretary of State, and was strongly supported by his party, as indeed because they're great environmentalists. You can't have it both ways. There's a cost.
It was Tony Blair.
yes, I think it goes back. Sorry, Chairman. It goes back.
Thank you, Dave.
It goes back to it goes a long way, and I don't defend what any government of any colour has done over this, and I don't understand why they think they have the right to tell us to assume that people out in the country don't realise that they don't want to just dump landfill. That we all, why, they're making the assumption that we don't realise that we should be reusing and recycling. It's a kind of nanny state sort of attitude to us, and I think it should be, and I think local authorities should stand up to it and say, you know, this is wrong. It's totally wrong. A bit like the Boston Tea Party, isn't it? It's taxation, and look where that led to. It's taxation which is not justified, in my view.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah. Bill?
Yes, we were promised a paper on reuse. If I remember right, it was raised about 3 meetings ago about reuse at our refuge sites, and I'm not pressing when it's going to come, but I think we were told that a paper would be coming about reuse, how it could be introduced to a greater degree than what we are at the moment. Some authorities have a great deal of income from reuse, and I don't see why. Now we run the tips ourselves, apart from one I understand, which we still don't have in our ownership, running wise, that why we can't promote reuse to a greater degree.
Joe?
You'll forgive me, I'm not aware that we committed to bring a report back on reuse. However, what I can say is that linked to the whole future service offer for the recycling house or waste sites, one of which is this element, is this proposal around reuse. We would be coming back to scrutiny anyway, and we would cover all 3 of those elements. What are we planning to do in relation to Whetstone? What's the proposed approach to reuse, and how wide-reaching that is in terms of service change at the 14 sites? So we could incorporate, but I will absolutely have a look through past minutes, and apologies if I just can't recall it, but I think we can come back to a future meeting. It will be in this calendar year that we will be coming back to scrutiny on those measures anyway.
Okay, Bill. Okay, thank you for that. Paul and then Christine.
Following the recent government announcement regarding food waste, have you had any initial thoughts about the impact of that in Leicestershire?
Joe, I think this weekend. Was it? It came out.
It actually
or Christmas?
came. I think the exact way we view it in the offices is someone in DEFRA sat like that and pushed the button and then went on Christmas leave for 2 weeks. I think that's how it normally works, Chair. I think officers in my team, it's a couple of 100-page document, the new strategy. It does allude to separate collection of food waste being mandatory. What we need to understand is when that would be introduced and what exactly does that mean. It sounds very clear, but from a disposal authority point of view, does it actually mean separate, or does it mean with green waste? And that's a very different solution that we need to put in place. You know, could they mix the food with green? Absolutely, if you're a district council, you could technologically do it. But is the government wanting it as a separate collected stream? So they're proposing to do a consultation this calendar year on that, and we would actively want to engage in that consultation, as would the district councils, as I understand. So we are taking stock, and again, through you, Chair, when we have an agenda planning, I was proposing that we would bring, though I accept it is somewhat for information, but we've been alluding to this document coming from government for quite some time. So I was proposing to summarise the key messages from within it and bring it back to scrutiny for discussion.
Also, I just do have a request from Bill that the report be circulated to members' lounges of all parties, so that we can have access when we. I think that was a good idea. Thank you very much. Sorry, Christine, and then you go on, Byron.
Just a quick one. I think I'm slightly, as though David Bill, a slight apology. An informant who follows these proceedings closely has just texted me and to remind me that the landfill tax was introduced on the 1st of October 1996 under John Major. So there we go.
Well, very honourable to try and get it right. Christine.
Yeah, just really for information, the County Council do hold classes about how to reuse stuff and furniture and that, and to I could say regenerate it, but that's not the right word, re-renovate it. and what have you. And some of the classes are absolutely brilliant. And the point that Mr. Bill's made is, yes, a lot of the stuff that goes down to the recycling centres, the refuge tips, is usable by other families. You know, you can go down there, you can see children's bikes, children's toys, and it's something that I know that we're really looking at, because it does seem a shame that they just get thrown away when they could be quite easily reused if you're handy at doing that sort of thing, which I'm not. But I'm sure there's a lot of people, because you've got like men with sheds, haven't you, that do and repair, all right, and ladies with sheds as well. My shed's full of absolute rubbish at the moment. But no, I think it's something that we've really got to look at, because it's a shame that some of the stuff that's, getting thrown away that can be reused quite easily.
I think we've discussed that really well. We'll move on now to paragraphs 18, 19, page 19, savings under development. Anne?
Certainly. This is the next generation savings. You know, the ones we've just been discussing are the ones that we are working on at the moment and anticipate bringing forward and delivering on. This section is about the next generation that we will be looking at, or would want to be looking at, because we fully acknowledge, and the figures are there for you in paragraph 18, the shortfall just 2 years down the line, and then at the end of the MTFS period, nearly 20 million shortfall at the moment as we stand. What we have done is we've worked with the Corporate Transformation Unit on a slightly different approach to, what we could be doing next to provide some savings, and we've called that the Strategic Challenge Programme. And what we did is we jetted various business analysts into an area of work, and in this one we actually looked at our highways delivery side to basically have several brainstorming sessions. What can we look at? Where could we? Where do we think we can get further savings, either through efficiencies, from doing differently, etc., etc. Now that project generated over 100 ideas. Now many of those will fall by the wayside, but hopefully there will be, a small number that we can bring back to you in time to say, this one's got legs, we think it can generate X saving, and this is what we're proposing. So it's about that work that is underway to think, what are the next things we'll be bringing forward to try and help meet some of those gaps in the latter years of the MTFS.
Thank you, Anne. Hilary, you've got a question.
Thank you. I think this is a splendid idea, getting brainstorming ideas, because quite often it's people on the ground level that come through with the best ideas. They really do, because they see it from a different aspect. I'm delighted to hear you'll be bringing back some of the suggestions that do have legs and we can run with. Would you hope to get that through to us in this calendar year? I'm not talking council years, but some ideas coming forward prior to January 2020, because why I say is that some of these ideas may come through, may be really quite simple and easy to put into place, and others may take some planning up until the time you're looking at in the future. It depends, you don't want to still be talking about the ideas with legs in a year's time if there are some that could be brought forward economically quite soon.
What we would say is very much horses for courses. The normal process we have, we'll have the initial reviews and feasibility, and then we'll build a business case, an outline, and then a full business case, and that'll go through various stages. Now, depending on the complexity of what it is, it'll take longer to do that. But we'd anticipate, as you're saying, if there's stuff that's like much more short term, easier to implement, hopefully that's a fairly quick process. And I would definitely hope to be bringing stuff in, I would say, in the next financial year, maybe not the calendar, but financial, because given the timescales of those gaps, we do need to be bringing forward the next 2, 3, 4 year plans on what we're doing in savings. So yeah, in the next financial year, I would certainly anticipate bringing some stuff back.
Thank you. No other question. We move on to external influence and other funding sources. This is paragraphs 20-25, pages 19 to 21.
Okay, yeah, some of this I'm sure, won't be news to you because they're the same, external influences, and, I tend to think of them as risks, but, the same ones we have across our service areas. But just to remind you, fuel costs, obviously we spend roughly about 6 million on fuel as a department, fairly significant cost. 10% change or more than that, as we all know we've witnessed in the past, has a significant impact on our budgets, and, I know you'll appreciate that. Waste tonnages, we've touched on this before in terms of entirely demand driven, and we have to meet that. Hopefully the waste strategy is going the right way about that and waste tonnages. But we've worked on traditionally 1% growth per annum. That changes, big impact on our budgets. The next bit, the market price for recyclates, and this, I've been quite surprised about how volatile some of this can be. We are asking, for instance, our RHWS to recycle certain materials, etc. But that's on the basis that it's a market to take it to, etc. One that you might be more familiar with latterly is rigid plastics. The market for that's kind of disappeared at the moment. However, we still need to have a bit of a stream that if a market does re-emerge, that actually we can test it and we can send some stuff to that. But, and the example in that's given in paragraph 24 about the change in price for mixed paper is, absolutely significant. They're big swings. It's a really volatile market. But, a lot of our assumptions are based on certain pricing, and there can be a lot of volatility in that, so it's a whole risk to our budgets. So it's certainly worth highlighting that one to you. I must stop there. Are we going on to other funding sources? Sorry, Chair, I've lost track on that one. Yes, we are. We're going on to the next section there, other funding sources. This is, when I mentioned to you earlier about the particularly in the revenue side of it, that was a net figure in terms of our 68 million roughly per annum for budget, 67, 68 million. The overall figure is 109 million. A lot of these things in this section, paragraph 25, are the things that cause that net position, okay? So just quickly, that section 38 and 278 agreements, that's developer work. So we get income in order to either do inspections or approvals, etc. for the developments. Capital income fee, we have, and as you're aware, increasing capital programme, and this is about where we can legitimately charge staff time back to those capital projects, and they bear the cost of those staff. External works charges to other bodies, an example there being a permitting scheme for roadworks. Utilities, developers have to pay us for a permit, etc. And equally, we also have the ability to fine them if they don't comply with their permits, so there's income streams there. All goes back into running the service. Capital substitution. This is something whereby, the corporate centre in terms of finance, they will allow us to basically take off our capital programme in order to relieve the pressure on the revenue side. So it's that capital substitution. It's the revenue side we're majorly challenged on in delivering those core services. Driver education workshop, if anybody has been either lucky or unlucky to go on some of those because you've been exceeding the speed limit by not too much, however. This is the income fee we get from that into the Road Safety Partnership. But again, that goes back into specific initiatives across the service areas in terms of operating costs, but that comes from those speed awareness courses. Joint income arrangements, we have a number. Key one is with the City Council, whereby we provide for them their concessionary travel. We commission their a few bus services on their behalf, travel line, park and ride. We perform, we undertake those services for them, for which we obviously get an income stream from. Civil parking enforcement. This is a partnership with all the districts in terms of parking enforcement. They carry out the actual enforcement on the street, but we do the back office notice processing, i.e. the ticket processing element for ourselves for on-street parking and for the districts for off-street parking, and that's what that income stream relates to, providing that service. Vehicle workshop, this is making sure we're charging the cost of vehicles and plant back to capital projects where we're able to do that. Trace rate income and income from charging at RHWS. Again, I think that's fairly self-evident, and we've touched on that in some other discussions earlier. We get very specific small grants, you know, not an awful lot, totals 0.9 of a million there. Income from the sale of recyclable materials, so, but, you know, that's what we're looking at to increase in terms of that reuse initiative, but that's what the current level is. And the Road Safety Partnership provides a stream for road safety schemes as well. The last one is our model. We have what I would say is nationally leading transport model, and actually we do benefit from it, not only from having that and being able to use it in our own schemes and for funding bids, etc., but also for an income stream to fund that modelling team from others giving others access to that transport model. I will stop there, Chair.
Thank you, Anne. Max?
Thanks. Talking modelling, I thought the gritting software that we maintain here and the forecasting was extremely good. It was on display last full council meeting. Yes, it's on the external external influences. I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that the budget is compiled on the basis of no pay or price inflation. Is that in-year pay and price inflation? Sorry, I'm referring back to page 14, bottom of page 14, paragraph 9. But it is an external influence, and that's my excuse.
Nick?
Thank you, Chair. The way when we set the budgets at the start of the year, we kind of don't actually allocate the inflation out to the departments at that point in time. We provide centrally for an overall inflation contingency, and then as we kind of understand more what those inflationary pressures are as we move through the year, money is released from that inflation contingency and allocated out to the service departments. And essentially, if you look at the table in table 1 on paragraph 8, the budget transfers and adjustments through the year that have been added to it is essentially that inflation money being allocated back to the department in the year. So that's the mechanism we use for covering inflation costs.
Yeah. Thank you, Max. Thank you for that feedback. Was there any other question there? Did I see? Sorry, Bill.
Yeah, it's quite simple, Chair. Page 20, permit scheme, introduced last year. Be nice to know how much money you actually made out of the permit scheme, just as a matter of information. Something that's been introduced, we need to know what it's generated, shall we say.
Ian, can you answer that?
Yes, certainly can. We're not allowed to make a surplus, generate money from a permit scheme. It has to be cost neutral. However, what we can do is pay for all of the staff and so forth that we might have been doing works before. We are currently undertaking a review because we're now 12 months in of what's happened with the permit scheme, the benefits, the costs and so forth. And that was something we said we would bring back here once we got that report done, because members were very interested in roadworks and permits.
Thank you. And is that okay, Bill? And we'll, I'm sure we'll get that in the next few months. No, I really appreciate that.
Okay, thank you very much. Table 3 on page 21 gives you that overall picture for the department over the MTFS period. As you will see, it does vary from year to year. We do have a significant capital programme, 47 million, and totality 171 over those 4 years. What we'll see is that's a capital we're aware of now. You know, as you will know, you know, the way government likes to allocate capital for highway infrastructure tends to be through competitive processes. So this is everything we have and have secured at the moment. We are just about, as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, to in March submit a couple of bids for housing infrastructure funding, which, you know, 100 million, give or take, etc. So I would fully expect over, regardless of whether we're successful in those or not, over the life of the MTFS, this capital situation will change, hopefully be added to, as, you know, hopefully, she's optimistic, we successfully secure some bids, so it is a movable feast. But however, that is as it stands at the moment, which is a significant capital programme. In terms of the table on page 4, I think it's worth just spending a couple of minutes on that, because again, you've got your breakdown for the Highways and Transport Capital Programme. What would I say? Those first 4 lines there, the grants from government, they are indicative amounts. What we always do is government likes to write to you with, here's your allocation for this year, and the next couple of years you've got an indicative figure, but they don't then confirm that until you're just coming into that financial year or partway. I can't remember exactly when they confirm it, but they do at some point confirm you've definitely got this for this financial year. So particularly for, you know, the latter years of the MTFS, they are indicative allocations. We're assuming that's what we'll get based on our current allocations. So who knows if that will change. The other thing is the third line, the grant, the LTP maintenance incentive element. That has the assumption that we achieve level 3 in terms of our asset management approach. That is self-assessed. We have to fill in a questionnaire and submit it to government. And our last submission, we have self-assessed ourselves at level 3. So hopefully that will be retrained, and there will be nothing that changes that position, in which case we're maximising the amount of capital we can achieve in that. If not, and it's actually on page 23, it shows you what the difference is if we do not achieve that. Moving on, covered that. The only other thing I would say is, additionally, you know, we do get some one-off allocations from government, depending on whether they've got some funding spare, and you know that will be in addition to what you see there. I think a couple of things I would highlight to you. While capital funding relies on many bidding or grants, but most, in the large part, bidding in the current time, and I did mention earlier in terms of growth and pressures on the department, we do need to have money, advanced design money, in order to be in a position to put in a robust bid to these funding streams. And as I've alluded to before, and give you the example of Melton, you know, 4 million to be in a position to deliver the business case for achieving that, the 49.5 million that we achieved from the government towards that scheme. That is a real pressure on our capital programme. At the moment, we've got just over 6 million allocated in our advanced design pot. However, that's fully you know, allocated to schemes we're working on at the moment. If there's new funding streams coming forward, in order to go for them, such as, and I'm sure I've mentioned it to you before at this committee, major road network, which is new network hierarchy government has constituted, but we will have the ability to bid into from 2020. We will need additional funding in order to be able to do that. The other aspect that's a pressure for not so much the E&T budget, but certainly corporately in terms of capital, is they're always looking for some element of match funding. Yeah. So if we are to be successful, we can't ask for 100% through that bidding opportunity. We need to be able to come up with some element of match funding. Now, the only two sources that are usually open to us are developer contributions or our own capital. Again, it's a demand on a wider capital programme that Mr. Rose here has the joy of balancing out. The summary of the successful bids we have at the moment are at the top of page 24. So I'm sure you'll be very familiar with those schemes. And as I've said, we've got 2 outstanding bids there. They're at paragraph 34 at the top of page 24. The detailed capital programme is in Appendix D, you know, really that breaks it down line by line for you. In terms of, you'll see from the overview that that first table we had of the overall programme. The vast majority of capital is on the highways and transport side, but we do have some significant capital works in environment and waste in terms of the RHWS, and some of those, particularly for instance Kibworth is up for a redevelopment. We're needing to address issues there, particularly about how vehicles and vehicles and pedestrians are segregated. We also are looking at bringing forward a new waste transfer station, which I mentioned earlier in the discussion, and there's always ongoing site improvements, particularly drainage works. And recently, just an example, I'm sure some of you know, at our Loughborough site we had to replace the push wall there. So there's ongoing capital works that are required across our RHWS estate as well. Anything else I need to particularly highlight to you? Future capital programme requirements are kind of outlined, paragraph 43, and that'll be the final thing, Chair, and I'll stop. These are things whereby we could very easily require some substantial capital for. Obviously, that will depend on the wider authority's ability to resource that, given our priorities, across the corporate estate. But, you will be aware we're, for instance, carrying out an average speed camera trial across the county at the moment. If we wanted to roll that out further, we have two options. Either government agrees to change their existing rules in Treasury, whereby we can retain some of the fines to pay for that capital, or LCC would need to be able to fund that. There's windrow composting facility, in order to address some of the aspects of the green waste market. There is an option there to expand on that, those disposal options for green waste. Melton RHWS, that certainly needs replacing because of the capacity in its existing site is very constrained. There aren't opportunities there to expand on that. So it's something that we ideally, looking across our estate for RHWS, we would want to address. And there's compaction equipment issues as well we would want to look at again for the RHWS. So it just gives you a feel there. There's always an ongoing need for capital, and it's a real challenge both for the department and wider corporately, and we will have to balance that out in terms of priority for service need across other corporate priorities.
Thank you, Anne. Hilary.
Thank you very much. I'd just like just a bit of clarification. If we look at page 24 and paragraph 36, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong because I don't come from Leicestershire, the Zoch Bridge, well, I'm getting there. You said that because of various things, the nitty-gritty is that it is the budgets from previous years will now be used in 2019-20, and therefore the work will be completed in the financial year 19-20. If we then look at page 35 and the commitments brought forward, the bridge, the Z Bridge replacement, is under the 2021 budget. Sorry.
Hi. I think that I suspect that the work won't finish in 1920, but if it does, then we will accelerate it forwards from 2021. Potentially, the number's just been put in the wrong year to match the text in the wording in the report.
Well, sorry, the text says 1920, and it's in 2021. So maybe it should be one or the other should be changed.
They should be consistent, yes. But I suspect that the works may well slip into 2021, and there's already, I think, 3 million plus that's in previous years that we will spend to do the work in 1920, and then there will still be some ongoing work in 2021. So I think in reality it might well be 2021 before the works are complete, which is probably why the 600,000 we put in there in the table, in that column in the table.
Sorry, I'm not being pedantic. I don't think it alters the figures at all, but it's just we're not the only people that go through these papers, and I think there should have been some consistency, because we're talking about the 600,000 under paragraph 36, and that's all I would say. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that observation, Hilary, and I'm sure Nick will sort it out. Thank you, Nick. Bill.
I'm picking my words carefully, Chair, because I'm sure the director will want to put the statement correct on this. That the cameras that have been introduced in the 7 districts, I think some of the Mercury coverage is perhaps rather unfortunate and actually got the information wrong or misunderstood the information that was available, being kind. So the director might like to answer that. But my major question is, it's down here for possible on the future capital works to actually do some more of these cameras. Now, they might well be asked for by the local residents, but I want somewhere to report sometime in the future the effectiveness of these compared with other forms of traffic speed measuring, whether it's flashing up signs or whether it's something else. Which is the most effective in reducing the speed of traffic? We all agree we need to reduce the speed of traffic in built-up areas, so is this cost-effective way of doing it, or is another method more cost-effective? And really, the one I was going to put to somebody else, but Mr. Rhodes is here, so Mr. Rhodes can back this one, is that it was suggested by the leader when it's introduced at the full council meeting, quite surprisingly, that this is going to happen, that he was going to lobby central government for us to keep the money from these cameras to pay for the cameras. And then after then, the money will be fed back into central government coffers. This is a year down the line. Now, I'm sure if Mr. Rhodes has got the contacts he has with central government, to enable this to roll out, if that's what we want to do, he can use his good contacts with the government, while they're still in office, or maybe not in office, but we don't know yet, to use his contacts to actually help us on this path. I know the director has got some letters. I mean, Mr. Crossman, when he was here, did write to the Secretary of State for something or other and got some answer, and then somebody else wrote another answer. But, you know, Mr. Rhodes is a very high position, and I'm sure he can bring some pressure to bear upon central government.
So where do we start? Anne first, or Byron? Who wants to?
Let's deal with that. I mean, yes, there has been correspondence between the leader and the Treasury. They are in the driving seat here, not other departments, and in particular with the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury is a man called Robert Jenrick MP. We think they have, at this stage, misunderstood what we're trying to do, because the general policy of the Treasury is not to hypothecate the revenues from fine income for speed cameras. Whereas what we're especially trying to do is to devote part of the income in the first year, or the income in the first year, to defraying the capital cost of installing them, so that we can recycle the money and bring it back. So we haven't given up, and now a meeting has been offered to us by the Exchequer Secretary, and that's going to take place, and we'll make or the leader will make the case directly to him, and we'll see where we go.
Sorry, what was that?
It'll be reported in due course to the council, either through the cabinet or through a position statement. It will be reported back where we stand.
Thank you, Byron. Anne, anything to add?
Well, I'll just add to that, but on the Mr. Bolter's point about the report back and the evaluation on average speed cameras, we'd always said under undertaking this, we would do an evaluation at the end of the year trial. So we will come back to look at how effective, and as you quite rightly say, is it more effective than other means of achieving speed reduction in those type of environments. And certainly at that time, if there's not news before, we would certainly update the position with the Treasury as well. As to the other matter about somewhat inaccurate reporting last weekend about the average speed cameras and about their operation, I will take the opportunity, if that's all right, Chair, just to clarify that point. This system was set up very much on the basis of there is 7 sites around the county. There are cameras, number of cameras because they're in pairs. So depending on the road environment, how many pairs of cameras have got at each of those sites. They are operational all the time, collecting data. However, the system was devised that only a number of those sites, not all 7, will be enforcing at any one time. So whereas the media were reporting last week that we had switched, or we were switching them off because we'd run out of money, absolutely inaccurate. The system is designed to enforce only a number of them at a time. Reasons being on that are the back office software required in order to do that enforcement. And, we would have had to, in terms of the amount and quantity you would need to, we went for a certain amount. And the other restricting factors are the police resources in order to enforce and the court resources in order to take through the process. So the scheme was very much devised on collecting data, all 7 sites 24/7, however, only enforcing a number of sites at a time. Now, bear in mind, the objective of this, and I will stress time and time again, is not to fine people, it's to change behaviour. The whole reason we've put these in are because the communities are concerned about the speed and it's their quality of life and its safety. What we want out of this is not the funding and the money and the income and the fines. We want them to stick to or below the speed limit. The very fact the camera is there, regardless of whether it's enforcing at that time, hopefully, and as we've looked at some of the sites and the early evidence coming out of those, is showing we're achieving high rates of compliance with that, regardless of whether it's been enforced at that time. Okay.
Thank you, Anne. That was very passionate, and I hope you drive very careful when you go home tonight. Any questions before we move on to the next?
Could I just ask a question, please? So just to clarify then, in terms of court costs and police costs, how will that be mitigated in the future should these be made permanent and or other installations be put up in the county, permanent ones?
So under the Road Safety Partnership, which is Leicester, Leicestershire, Rutland and the police, part of that is operating the cameras around the county, both fixed and for ourselves, these average cameras. The fixed cameras, and we're following the same model for our average, the police receive a certain amount of income, just over £40, back from the government for processing the speed offences that they're detected and taken through, whether they go to a driver education workshop, and thank you everyone for the donations, or go to court and get fined. So that's how it plays for the police processing part. But as you can imagine, the amount of resource you actually need and the number of people you can put in a building, if you have hundreds of millions of offences, you couldn't have too many people. So the model that we're following for the cameras is exactly the same as most other authorities and partnerships follow, about controlling the level of enforcement, the money that comes back from the government, and a proportionate amount of resource to follow it. So ongoing costs for ourselves, revenue-wise, for the average speed cameras, what we should only have to pay is the recalibration each year of the cameras once they're in, which is why Byron and the leader are trying to get the capital cost paid for. The other point I would just say quite interestingly is, remember, average speed cameras can be put anywhere. Road humps and other measures you wouldn't want to put on, say, the A50 outside here. So it's about horses for courses as well.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Quite surprisingly, in the Emirates, they do put them on main roads. I couldn't believe it, but that's another story. David, are you going to tell us about your fine when you got caught?
Not,
okay.
No, we'll draw a veil over that one. The page 22, there's a reference there to the, I'm jumping around a bit here, but National Productivity Investment Fund, or the local transport plan, I think. Anyway, there's £2.7 million to be spent every year on that up to 2023, and as I understand, well, 2.7, the top line is 2.7, 2019-20. Then there's a 2.7 again. Well, I'm not sure which of these two funds I'm going to be asking about, but I think it must be the top one, because I'm getting back to the Hinckley scheme, which is referred to, which is referred to on the top of page 24, Hinckley Junctions, which I think must be far more than just the straightforward 2.7. That puzzles me a little bit, because I think the scheme, the scheme which is being discussed for the two Hinckley Junctions is something like £8 million. So perhaps I've confused. So I think it must come out of the local transport plan monies. Is that correct for a start?
The Hinckley scheme is before, forgive me, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's between 4 and 5 million. It's been funded by the National Productivity Investment Fund, so it is that 2.78, plus some developer contributions, plus some of LCC's own capital. Okay?
I don't want to be awkward about this, but I don't want to upset any of the officers about this either. But I did start to discuss this just before Christmas, and I'm wondering just how far the design has got to that scheme, or which is a joint, it's a combined effort, because the real problem we have at those junctions is not the junctions themselves so much as the railway bridge between the two. And I'm wondering, even at this late stage, whether there is any scope for looking at that scheme to see whether the capacity of the railway bridge could be included in any improvements that take place. I've been looking at the costs of this from other parts of the country, and the costs are not that outrageous when you compare to the 4 million that is going to be spent, or whatever it is going to be spent in totality on those junctions. So this is really a plea just to look at the capacity of that railway bridge, to see whether attention to that would be a better solution, or part of an improved solution to the problems that we have continually in Hinckley during the course of the day.
Okay. Could I just ask Anne to maybe personally discuss this? I think this is after the meeting, or I do understand it's a Hinckley issue, but I think as a scrutiny issue, I think you could discuss it personally. Because is that right with you, David? That's fine. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Chair, if I may, I'm going to attempt to go through this.
If
I may, I'd also like to introduce James O'Brien, who's a team manager in my branch, and I think it's safe to say understands the background to these papers far better than I. So if you've got any really technical trip-me-up questions, I'm going to look to my left. Okay. I'm conscious these are quite meaty reports, and they all lead one into the other almost, so they cover different spheres of influence. But if I start with the annual performance report and greenhouse gas, obviously it's a report in two parts, and it covers the 17-18 performance. In the background to both of those reports on page 38, it highlights the County Council's key targets linked to reducing carbon emissions by 34% by 2021. a target that's also been applied to the greenhouse gases. In the report, we do explain the requirement to publish an annual greenhouse gas report, and that is a standard template report. And we explain the carbon reduction commitment, which is a mandatory carbon emissions and pricing scheme. So that's just in the overarching text of the two reports. So with that in mind, I think it's also worth me just reiterating, because this committee considered our new environment strategy in July of last year, but this is relating to the old strategy, so for 17-18. So you'll forgive me, we've tried to give as much up-to-date information as we can where it exists, but this relates to the old strategy in terms of that year's reporting. So if I look at the annual environmental performance report first, you may be happy that I wasn't proposing to take members through it line by line. Rather, I was planning to highlight some key messages, but I'm very happy for James and I to take any questions if we don't specifically cover something that's in this report, but I don't mention it. There is also a summary dashboard at Appendix B on page 61. So if we look at the measures, never to start on a negative, but if we look at the ones that are currently behind target, total CO2 emissions from roads, there is a 3.2% rise, and that's above the target. I think we've debated this in different quarters, but it reflects the higher traffic volumes on the road network. These are the challenges that we face environmentally, taking things forward, but recognising growth and investment in the economy. So this is a difficult one for us to address, but certainly in terms of mitigation, Mr. Viers and his teams through the local transport plan and the sustainable travel look to try and address that. So we do have plans in place to try and continue on an ongoing basis to mitigate. There's also a section in the report that looks at risks where we're behind target. There's one around climate change risk, and that's linked to flood risk on the highways network. And again, we've discussed here around the risk-based approach to gully emptying, which is a means to potentially mitigate that risk going forward. But it's scoring over 15 at the moment, so we acknowledge it. There's also a number of environmental risks. The report alludes to 17 at the time that we were writing, but it's subsequently already come down to 12. And again, they're all over 15 at this point, and they're covered in more detail on pages 41 and 42. But if I just touch on some, there's some, we've definitely discussed these in our quarterly performance reports that you get every quarter anyway, but some around the passenger transport depots, which we're looking to address through engineering measures, and a number at the recycling house or waste sites, which we covered under the MTFS in terms of investments that we need to make to some of the drainage and works at Kibworth. So again, we have built into that capital programme our ability to tackle some of those works and engineering solutions, and we'll take those forward. I think it's just a useful point at which also to mention, actually, in terms of whilst these are behind target, when we started having our environmental management system, we had over 200 environmental risks. So actually, we're down into the, yes, very challenging, but the small numbers that we need to tackle. There are some on biodiversity, and I would be wrong if I didn't acknowledge that actually I think that's an area that we'll have to prioritise going forward. The sites of special scientific interest, we've talked about it with colleagues here, and the wildlife sites, it is not an easy solution, and actually it will be reporting for a long time, I think, before we turn that around. We do have biodiversity that's in decline, and we need a strategic approach, so that's become one of the early priorities in the new strategy that we're going to take forward, so we acknowledge that. And there's some on the wider waste stuff to do with performance at our own sites at County Hall, and then the wider network in terms of our performance overall in Leicestershire on waste recycling and disposal. And again, if there are any specific questions on that, but we did have a really detailed report in October of last year about the reasons behind why that's gone down. In terms of just on the biodiversity, we've also set up a working group to start and take that work forward. If we then look at some of the measures that are ahead of target, CO2 emissions, overall, I think a good news story. Again, we've reported in the past, strong performance, a downward trend. I think operationally we've got a 25% CO2 emissions reduction in the last year, 61% overall compared to that 34% target. So we are well ahead of where we want to be and still looking for opportunities to do more. And they're covered in point 38 of the report. But you know these are linked to things like street lightings, investments in solar panels, etc. Equally linked to that, renewable energy generation is up, which is good, and business mileage claims are down, also good. More generally, we've had no environmental prosecutions, a very low number of environmental complaints. We've had 5 in the year that we're looking at, and no environmental incidents in 17-18. Lastly, on staffing, we've got a new e-learning tool that all our staffers, they do that as part of their mandatory training, and it looks at their views on our environmental performance, and it shows largely strong support for our approach and their understanding of their role in it. But as that rolls forward, we'll get more metrics from our staff. So overall, I think to summarise, the green aid indicators have gone up from 7 to 9. We do accept that the red have also gone up from 5 to 7, but I would just counter that with most of the ambers and reds in the report are in areas where we don't have complete control, so we have limited control. That doesn't negate the fact that we're still trying to work on those. There were some areas with incomplete data, and we continue to work right across the authority to try and tackle the efficiency of that data, so that's an ongoing one. And I mentioned risks earlier. I think other than maybe I would mention on risks that we had an external audit of our environmental management system in 2017, and we use ISO 14001 for parts of that, and we had no non-compliances, so we were recertified for 3 years, so that gives us a good health check on our management system for the environment. And lastly, on this element of the report, we do acknowledge, as I've said, the opportunities to tackle new priorities in the new environment strategy. I've mentioned biodiversity. The one I haven't mentioned is arguably this fleet and carbon emissions, which I've said is not necessarily going in the right direction. But we are working on a 10-year vehicle replacement plan, so we would look at greening our fleet and the opportunities in that going forward. So they're both new priority areas. I'll plough on, if okay, onto part 2 of the report and then take questions on the whole thing. But the second part of the report covers the greenhouse gas report, again, against the old strategy. And the template report, the director's report, is a national template we have to publish on the website. So it might look unusual, but it's just because it's a standard template report, and we would publish that on the website after Scrutiny's noted it. The introductory text summarises why we produced the report, linked to measuring our environmental performance and commitment to reduce carbon. I mentioned that 34% target that we are achieving and exceeding. And the report explains the various, what we call scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions and how those calculations are made. And there's a table that covers where they fall within those categories. And we do also mention the conversion factors that need to be used. What I'd say is we use actual billing information and real consumption wherever we can, so it's genuine data that we hold. The 17-18 performance data is explained from page 54, and again, whilst I wasn't going to go through all the figures, the overarching message I think is one of good news and strong performance with progress in the majority of areas. A couple of highlights. I've already mentioned that emissions have fallen by over 55% against the baseline and 37% even just from 16-17, so in just 1 year. And aside from that slight increase in emissions from council buildings, which we do talk about in the report, but I think that was linked to the fact we had a very cold winter, so our fuel usage will be interesting to monitor that going forward. Other than that, we've seen substantial reductions in fleet fuel usage. Not easy for me to say being a Geordie, I can tell you. Buildings, electricity, street lighting, business travel, and increases in renewables linked to the PV solar panel investment on the estate and our biomass boiler. I think the last point I'd highlight is on page 49, point 71. There is a positive financial impact of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions under the carbon reduction commitment, which means that our emissions, where we have to pay a fee for each tonne of carbon that we emit, you can see that that's translating in a reduction in that bill of £83,000 between 16-17 and last year. It would be wrong of me not to accept. I think this is a good report in terms of progress, but I think the challenges for officers is to continue to drive forward the increasingly more challenging areas that we'll have to go to see increased performance. And I'll take any questions. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Just a clarification, because just before I go on to Bill, on page 53, you've got item 7. Sounds a bit strange because it mentions external assurance statement that we did not sort independent external. That is actually a statutory sort of line we have to put in, taking into account that in 2017 we were proving that our as just mentioned, the report was that we 100% and we're doing it right. So just to save any confusion there, it's just something, it's not our report, we have to put it in, but in general our system is working fine. Okay, Bill.
Sorry, when these things are going to happen. It's all right in a report saying we're looking at environmental solutions, engineering solutions, but we don't know when, even roughly when it's going to take place. And the one that really got me was the last one on the corporate resources. And I thought Mr. Rose might like to take this forward, because it says here, still awaiting rollout of lockable waste bins. 12 months been waiting for that. Well, surely it's not beyond the wit of man to get lockable waste bins, is it? You know, what's the lead time for that? About 3 weeks when you order them? So, you know, I thought that was ought to be done sooner rather than later. The other one I'd like an answer on sometime is the closure of the mechanical biological treatment at wherever it was. Why was it closed in the first place? Because we never had that in a report anywhere. Why it was? I know officers know the reason why, but we as members don't know the reason why. And I think it's for completeness we ought to know why it's no longer being used. And we talk further on about the amount of aggregate that's not used now of recycled aggregate, which is way down to what it was. Is the reason for that? And the last pet one of mine, oh, two actually, on page 47 we're talking about electricity. Are we talking about normal electricity or green electricity? Because I understood that the county council's now bought into this green electricity, FOSS energy, and if so, why aren't we using that here? If that's green energy, why should we not use that if we're already putting money into that, surely we should get some benefit from that. And the last one, I suppose, give somebody else a chance, is we're still using this lovely white paper for our minutes. Why, oh why, when all the environmental problems that's causing, we're still using that? I will never know. Because if you go to our photocopies in the members' room, we go to a nice grey paper, which is less environmentally damaging. So, you know, I hope somebody somewhere takes notice of that and actually saves some of the environment by not using so much a bleaching agent. I won't say what we use, but bleaching agent to produce our paper. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Lots of questions. Over to Joe first, is it? But I know in some organisations they're totally paper free, where you've got to request hard copies. Everything's what I'm doing here on computer. So interesting. Yes. Well, you know, change is difficult, Bill. You know. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to try and answer all those, and you'll tell me which ones I've forgotten. I think if we just take the engineering solutions, if I just give an example on the recycling house or waste sites, they are scheduled in. So in some cases, for example, if you cross-reference the MTFS, we have lines in the capital now for waste that link to, I know, for example, at Shepshed and Bottisford, this coming financial year, we will do those engineering solutions. Now, we do have to liaise with people like Severn Trent and other third parties to ensure that we get the relevant consent orders, and sometimes there are delays on those, but at the minute, a bit like Mr. Wash said earlier, if there are delays, we can, you know, or we can escalate work, we push it back or pull it forward. But they are scheduled in, so we've done the design, we're doing the design works, we're planning for it. Kibworth, the director mentioned earlier, is a bigger piece of work, but it is scheduled in, and we will do the drainage as part of that works because it's obviously then the most cost-effective way to do it. The MBT closure, obviously we went into the detail of the impact on performance at the October last year report when we talked about the wider impact it's having on performance. But just to be clear, from a sort of technical perspective, what happened, the reason that contract failed was actually we have a contract with a company, and they had a back-to-back contract with the people who run the MBT, and it was actually their outlet for the product that's produced through that plant, which is called a refuse-derived fuel, an RDF. So you extract the metals, you turn it into a sort of homogeneous fuel type, and it was shipped to somewhere in the southwest, where it was fueling a cement kiln. And they, at that location, were struggling with their environmental permits, and they simply couldn't get their emissions under control to do with the actual cement kiln. So they were getting spikes in emissions. And ultimately, that just impacted on the financial costs in those back-to-back contracts to the point that the RDF contract failed. Without over-politicising, alongside that, Brexit has been happening, and that has impacted on the European UK market for RDF, i.e. you can export it, but you simply can't get the markets. They've simply dried up. So it meant that we were being posed with the question of paying an extra several £100 a tonne for that processing option, which simply is prohibitively expensive for what it should have been, so we allowed it to fail. But we have put in place alternate measures from 2020 that will go under a different contract, and we're out to contract for another big procurement contract for disposal, and we'll be looking for financial savings through that. So that's just to clarify the MBT arrangements. This is not an answer, but we will pick it up with colleagues in other departments around the lockable bins. On paper, you're absolutely right, it should be an issue. I think officers in other departments are working on it, but the bins are not ours. They belong to the company that's providing the contractual outlet, and I think those dialogues continue to happen, but we would want to secure lockable bins because it just impacts how people use them. So that is being progressed, and hopefully if we need to follow that up with quarterly performance or going forward, we can report back. The virgin aggregate, I think it's covered in the report, and I don't know if colleagues from a highways side, the bottom line is there's not the aggregate there at the minute to secure. So if there's a lull in the market and we simply can't secure enough of it, we can't buy it in. It's almost like it's overly successful, so our ability to source it's difficult to get. But we are looking at other opportunities all the time. And if I may, Chair, just on the issue of electricity and the FOSS energy and green, I'm just going to allow James to come in and comment, if that's okay.
Yeah, just to explain in terms of the green energy, in terms of the County Council itself, it is currently locked into an existing energy contract which runs out in 2020-2021, so we can't change that tariff until that time. Colleagues in property have agreed that when it next goes out to procurement for its energy contract, it will also include within that a requirement to price for a 100% renewable energy contract. The FOSS energy is a separate arrangement, and that's for households and businesses, well, households I think, so they can access energy tariffs through that kind of scheme, and it's not for ourselves as a kind of council.
Thank you. Is that okay, Bill?
Yeah, it's a start, Chair. Yes, it's a start.
Thank you, Bill.
Nobody's answering about the paper, though, are they? They're all giving...
Well, we may have a lot in stock. It could be like we've got a contract. It could be that argument. Any other questions, please? Okay, we'll move on to the next agenda item. Thank you, Joe. Item 10. This is to set out pages 63, 72 to do the infrastructure strategy and the LLEP energy. This is over to Anne again, is it? Or Joe? Joe? You're on form today, Joe.
Tell me when you get bored, I apologise. Okay, the energy infrastructure strategy, just to be clear, again, is a strategy that's been produced by the LEP, so it's not the County Council strategy per se, but not to detach ourselves from it. It was something that the County Council and the City have engaged around and contributed to. Indeed, James has gone to a lot of the meetings as it's been developed. So it is provided for information. This one does link to our new environment strategy objectives around reducing greenhouse gas and supporting the low carbon energy and developing a low carbon circular economy. And in our new strategy, there's also a specific action in the action plan, because it has a live action plan with it, to work with the LEP and the City to produce this document. So it is something that we always knew we were striving for. The report sets out the background as to why the LEP are required to produce an energy infrastructure strategy by government, and the government have asked that of all the LEP areas. and how it links to wider national and I think indeed international legislative frameworks such as the Clean Growth Strategy, the Strategic Growth Plan, and the Local Industrial Strategy, which I think is in development at the minute. So ultimately, the strategy is driven by a need to move Leicestershire to a low or zero carbon future by 2050. And the purpose of the strategy is to generate a list of projects or opportunities that are able to support that low carbon economic growth. But ultimately, it's one that's not reliant on a fossil fuel energy system. That's what they need to move towards. The LEP, in terms of process, used independent consultants, and the aims and approaches used to produce the document are set out on page 65, but they include things like a full policy review, desktop studies, consultation with key stakeholders, and a look at our current and future energy use using 3 scenarios. Again, if you've got any technical questions on those 3 scenarios, I'm sure James can help, but they basically had a baseline scenario, one that involved high electrification, which is arguably an area the government has tackled more fully around fossil fuels, and then a decarbonising of the gas grid, which is still emerging. It has not been as well developed. And they're all expanded upon in the report. If I just move on to the findings then, the report highlights energy use by sector, so, you know, transport, domestic, etc., those sectors, and looks at the future demand. And I think figure 1 at the top of page...
Sorry about this.
That's okay. Figure 1 at the top of page 66, I think, is quite useful in understanding the implications of not moving to a low carbon sources. So it kind of shows the impact that if we don't drive down, we'll have a shortfall in where we're securing our energy from, if not from fossil fuel sources. So, and obviously this ability for us to meet these CO2 emission reductions by 2050 of 80%. I've mentioned I wasn't going to go through the various scenarios, but they're covered in the report up to page 69. But we can take questions. What I would highlight is that the strategy sets out 8 recommended areas across 3 themes. So homes and businesses, the low carbon transport ambitions, and then smarter and cleaner power going forward. And actions that should or could be undertaken to help reduce emissions in that period up to 2050. The projects are summarised from page 70 of the report. And all I'd add is I think all those actions are what we define as low regret actions. So really they're kind of valid regardless of what national decisions are taken. We should be looking to drive some of these around decarbonisation going forward. So if I was to conclude, the LEP is suggesting that local action, and certainly central government as well, local action is now essential if the worst effects of climate change are to be mitigated. The County Council, we would argue, should have a role, but they will require cross-sector partnership to be effective over time. That's businesses, industry, innovators, etc. And will affect the use of energy in homes, businesses and all modes of transport. I think if I could end on a sort of positive, not that I think that's remotely negative, I think the recommendations, while cross-cutting and challenging, should provide confidence to businesses and investors that there's an opportunity in Leicestershire that translates into economic growth and create employment opportunities going forward.
Paul, then Bill, and then Max.
I think for our communities, this is probably the second important, other than the Brexit negotiation, to come. The reason I say that is the future is clear. Fossil fuels are being used too much. And the one area which I had something in my mind before I was going to speak, but something's just clicked in as well. There's recent evidence and reporting and analysis that actually one of the most contributory causes to greenhouse gases is actually the food we eat. It's not the necessarily electric cars. It's not necessarily generating the electricity with solar power. But if you consider, and I'm not a vegetarian, I'm not a vegan, but it begins to persuade you a little bit when you hear those numbers. Because if you remove meat from a diet, it over time, and over quite a short period of time, it removes the amount of methane that's been generated because of the animals that are on the land, which takes up land. So I think within those strategies on page 69, I think there's a large amount of carbon reduction based on the choice of food. I don't know if that comes into the strategy, but it has a large impact. And I think the more people think about that, I think the more reality will hit. What I was going to speak about, that was something that popped into my head, was that supporting electric cars. These diagrams on pages 66 and 67 really speak about the infrastructure of electrical generation, whichever source that comes from. At the moment, there are small pockets of charging units in car parks around Leicestershire and on the county council's footprint here. I think at the moment, unlike the construction to diesel car users a few years ago, it's been an about face for diesel car users that now they were clean and now they're dirty. I think with electric cars, as long as the infrastructure is there, that's the key thing, encouraging people to think about electric cars, having those charging units in communities. It might only be 1 or 2 in a car park. If the infrastructure is there to support it, I think we should be encouraging that installation, possibly by third-party funders, not ourselves, because they would generate an income from the site that they've put in. So they are my thoughts on that, because if you don't change how people use their mode of transport, you won't cut noxious gases, you won't cut. So you need to encourage, and I think that's one way of encouraging. Thank you.
That's more of a comment, isn't it? Your thoughts? Don't know if so.
Yeah, it's more.
If we're straight, you're making a comment.
I'm making a comment.
There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay.
Do I withdraw it now?
No. It's something that can be debated because, you know, as a sports scientist, humans are designed to eat meat, and there is a reason for that. So there is an argument, and we can debate it, but.
I don't think we want to start this afternoon, though.
So, no, you've made a comment, but we'll come on another couple of days. I agree, John. Next question is Bill.
Yeah, it's all very good, Chair, but until this country really gets to grips with this, we're never going to solve the problem. It really starts, in my opinion, with the building regulations. That's the thing that must be tightened up to make the national builders more concerned about environmental input that their buildings are actually generating. The building regulations are quite lax in this country compared with others, and they could well be tightened up. The house builders will scream it's going to put the price of houses up. But by how much? Some of the improvements that need to be done aren't terribly expensive on the cost of a house. That's just a few £100 for the cost of a new house. It's absolutely minimal to that price of the house. So that's the first thing they need to do. Second thing they need to do is to put some form of energy generation within each of the new houses that are built as part of that building, not added on afterwards, but built for the future. That's not been done either. But until the government, whatever flavour it happens to be, at the end of the month or whenever, needs to really get grips with this, because that's where the key changes will take place. But everybody's reluctant to go down this route, and I can't imagine any government actually taking it up at the present time. But that's what they need to do. They really need to push building regulations and actually make sure that they are implemented to the full.
Well, Bill, I don't disagree with that. Just in answer, I'm trying to get the information. I know there's a presentation at Coventry Council in regard to housing and how houses could be built. We talked what was the process where they generate heat from earth and actually really cut down the cost of energy. The houses are very efficient, and I do agree with you. We are changing, and I will sort of try and get that information because I know one of the people involved in the presentation, and hopefully we can get them around and see exactly what ideas they've got, because I think we have to be open to this. And as a county council, I think we need to lead the way and show that there is new processes. But the developers will always say, if you start adding a few hundred quid there, 500 quid there, there's always their argument as developers, so we have to be careful, but I don't disagree with you. But that's another good point. Max, you've got a question.
Thank you. First of all, to say these two reports are really excellent, and I'm pleased that they've appeared at the same time because in some ways they're complementary. Also, I thought figure 1 on page 66 was very revealing, but it does lean very heavily on electrification of transport and other facets. But it links to C15 in the first report on the CO2 emissions for road transport. Now, what strikes me about that is that we have a significant number of highways projects, and all the reports we've had to this committee about investment in the future in transport have tended to be in terms of highways, which of course militates against what we've got here in the report, which is an excess of CO2 from transport and an increase in congestion. Every road that we build, increases congestion in some way or another eventually. We do seem to have a predict and provide approach to road transport at the moment. That wasn't so in the past, and I think it was probably during the last decade that with the financial collapse and so on, we had a fuel tax escalator at that point. We had serious restrictions on car parking, and looking forward, measures both within local planning authorities and within ourselves to tackle this. And that seems to have disappeared from the agenda, understandably, with the emphasis on economic development, which and economic growth. So it's both positive and a little bit depressing here and there, but I'm grateful that they've been brought forward to the committee. On the point about food, which I thoroughly concur with, and it was a very interesting report from the medics this morning. I'm always struck when we come to full council that we have this enormous pile of meat in front of us when we queue up for our lunch, and a sort of little bit of vegetarian or vegan stuff on the side. I'd like that reversed one day, perhaps in the spirit of what they call a meat-free Monday, don't we? That every Monday, don't eat meat. So maybe we should have a meat-free council meeting, which Rhodes will probably be able to order. Thanks very much. Right.
Well, I won't comment on Byron's lunch because I was with him, so we will move on, Byron.
I was just going to tell you I had a vegetarian lunch today.
Well done.
As it happens. There is a point about this report which is very useful in a range of information that it's given us. And in particular, of course, it's ranging over the whole spectrum of areas where we can reduce the carbon effect. What we probably need is a more integrated report at some stage when more information and more studies have been done as to the overall effect and on the country eventually of going to electric cars and electric vehicles, because the obvious thing is that the vehicles themselves need to change, and the engineering for those is not yet reached a point where they can be deployed in large numbers. But then there's the whole question of the recharging issues and the range of the vehicles, which is a deterrent to having electric cars at the moment if you have to travel long distances. But more to the point is also the power consumption, because power, although it may be consumed ultimately by the vehicle, it's generated somewhere. Instead of being generated within the vehicle with an internal combustion engine, it's being generated further away in a power station somewhere, or in a wind farm, or in a solar thing. And I think what I've yet to see, others might have seen some some speculation on this, is what the total effect of this is going to be. And I know some research work is being done because it's been brought to my attention, but I haven't seen the comprehensive results of what the new energy picture will look like when we go all electric. And I think it may have certain downsides as well, I suspect. Regarding the conversion of houses, there's an enormous stock of houses already here, and some of them are getting quite old. I personally live in a very old house. I can tell you the conversion costs when I upgraded that house to make it energy efficient were a good deal more than a few £100 because of the nature of the way it was originally built. So I had to put insulation on the inside and the walls, which meant replastering and considerable amount of work, and of course the double glazing of all the windows as well. It's a massive undertaking when you try to upgrade an existing property. When you're building a new one, it's probably easier to build it in.
David, did you?
Reports have been challenging, and it simply reminds us of all the news that we're receiving. And there's a lot today about food, wasn't there, and cattle and sheep. And it strikes me that everything that we've been doing the last 200 years is now wrong. This country's wealth was built on coal, coke, iron ore, sheep, cattle. We went to the ends of the world to farm sheep, and this whole country's wealth has been effectively built on factors that we must now sort of start to think again. And we were perhaps all our ancestors was wrong, but there we are. But all these aspects of life made this country what it is. Now we've got to think again, and I think we ought to. Perhaps there should be a working party to take some of these points forward to see how we can contribute. The need for new houses, and we're going to fill this county with new houses. We've got to make sure that every single one of them complies to what Bill was suggesting, being energy efficient and water efficient, incidentally, because there's not going to be the water to supply all these houses. And we've got to look at cheaper, more efficient ways of transport, haven't we? So that we go over to electricity as soon as we possibly can. We've got to look at how we actually generate that electricity in the first place, and therefore we've got to accept the challenge of wind and solar, and wind, solar, and tidal energy. I think that Scotland now. There's a point now. Scotland has now reached a point where it is 100%. It can now be 100% reliant on wind energy. It's reached that tipping over point. So it is possible, but there are so many aspects of life that we ought to be looking at that perhaps at some point we should set up yet another task and finish group to see what positive moves we can make to move things along.
Okay, thank you, Joe.
Chair, I'm conscious of a lot of really valuable contributions just to the debate, but I thought it might be useful. Allowing for James possibly has a couple of useful points in terms of where this is going next. But at a high level, what I am aware of is these sort of almost lobbying for central government positions on approaches going forward. Slightly naive on my part, but James is actively involved. Ultimately, central government paid for all the LEP areas to produce these documents, and they require them to be submitted back. One could argue that they want to look at what the strong messages that are coming out of some of these reports are, things like perhaps home building measures on new builds, so to set their national position on their energy infrastructure strategy. So it's mandated that some of this intelligence will go back, and if there's some interesting consistent themes, I would like to think that the government has almost, in localising it but then taking the information back, will think about that at a national level. I also thought, I'm going to stay away from Meat Free Monday, if I may, though I do hear that catering are looking at that just don't hold me to it. But I thought it might just be really useful. There's a couple of points on the food side that might just be worth sharing.
Just to pick up on the food, I think it is an important point, particularly after the report that was released this morning. While food itself wasn't within the scope of this piece of research, and we can't do anything about the emissions from cattle and so on through this report. However, for Leicestershire, food industry is one of the key industries. So any work we can do on energy efficiency in the businesses, in the transport system and so on, will help contribute to reducing the emissions from the whole field to fork situation regarding food. But I do think we need to look at energy and transport in the whole, in terms of where it fits into the whole system. But this report was just focused on one aspect of the whole system. Just to add on to what Joe has said, we are ourselves in public health are actually working with our catering colleagues, but how can we reduce the environmental impact and improve the health impact of our catering facilities within the council? That's something we're working on at the moment. In terms of Byron's points about the impact of electric vehicles, he's right. There are loads of studies being carried out by universities nationally and globally on this, and it is one of the challenges. We need to move towards electric cars, at least in the short to medium term, until we can get hydrogen or another alternative fuel as a viable solution. But it is that dilemma of where do we get electricity from, you know. Yes, increasingly we can get it from renewable sources. I think at the moment, on average, the national grid is about 40% renewable, but we need to obviously move that closer to 100%. So it is a challenge, and with the infrastructure as well, but at least we're starting to move in the right direction. And it is possible, as was said earlier. I think last year in Norway, half the cars that were sold were electric cars. So other countries are doing it and making it work. So there's no reason why we in the UK can't do the same. We just have to learn the lessons from other countries.
Okay, thank you. This is maybe in the future. I'm sure it is a debate in depth, but we have to be careful as well. We have a thriving rural community that sell animals. And I'm not joking, if people are watching this in the countryside, they would be concerned. So we have to think of our farmers. I will debate that as a scientist about diet. I don't necessarily agree with the National Health. And in fact, I can go through research and actually prove. This morning they were trying to say 7 grams of bacon, which is a quarter of a slice. I just think we have to get real. And so we have to be careful of information and science, and question it and challenge it. We need to do that. And just to reiterate, our ancestors, the meat eating, were 6'2", 6'3", and very strong and lived quite long. And that's what the research says. And in 1914, the average size of a British man who didn't eat much meat was 5'6", and the woman was 5 foot. So there was a change there. So I think we have to be careful. That's all. So I think we need to move on. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Number 11, item number 11. Thank you. I'm sure we'll get through this quite quickly now. Is that your turn, Ian? Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I'm still just recovering from finding out how much above average I am. That's quite nice.
Very above average. Well, from 1914.
Only anyway. In height-wise, though, I must say. Okay. Thank you, Chair. We brought a report here just to inform members of the committee about the work that Midlands Connect has been undertaking on the A46 in general, and to focus in on some of the specific areas around Leicestershire, because I know they're of interest to most members and the residents. Just to remind members, we've spoken about it here before on a number of occasions. Midlands Connect has been launched for some time now, and in 2017 it launched its Connect strategy, which looked at a number of major infrastructure projects, both rail and road and others, but the one we're talking about today was the A46. It looked at in very high level form, but basically it was starting to recognise that the A46 could provide some very national and regional strategic relief to, such as the Birmingham box, the motorways around Birmingham. It could really aid economic development and housing growth, amongst other things, as listed there in paragraph 7. I won't dwell too long on that. The A46, once you start looking at a very big idea that's national, you have to look at it in its entirety, and then you have an iterative process to really understand the evidence of what it's telling you before you commit major resources to fund the next levels of study. So there is a map there just for everyone's attention. Sorry, the quality is, as always, when you lift one from someone else's document, a little ropey, but on page 82, Appendix A, the Midlands Connect study does have that map. But the A46 is 155 miles long, and it varies considerably as you go from one end at the M5 all the way up to Hull, and with various sections, with Leicester sat at a very, very important junction in the middle. The Leicester and Leicestershire Strategic Growth Plan is worth mentioning. As you know, as the Midlands Connect work has been coming out, one of the major thrusts of how you could achieve economic growth, housing growth in Leicestershire, which was through the Strategic Growth Plan out to 2050, is built around the concept of an A46 expressway around the south of the county. However, I must reiterate at this point, there is no line for that junction yet. There is no line in the Midlands Connect study, and that would come at some very future point, many, many years in the future. So moving on to the Midlands Connect study, it's a very large, comprehensive document, but at a very high level. It was released on the 7th of November. And I'm sure you, like me, will have gone through and read it at depth of all the things that it might mention. But basically, it's first of all reiterates, is it a good idea to look at the A46 and can it contribute to the region and what Midlands Connect are trying to achieve? And yes, it does. There are a number of sections that it really contributes, maybe not from end to end, such as the M1 journeys, but on various sections throughout the A46, specifically around our sections in the Leicestershire, it really contributes to the economic well-being of the country as a whole. Midlands Connect has therefore started to study what those main areas you might wish to focus on, and it undertook some very high-level traffic modelling, and I'm saying very high level, it is the Highways England national model, so it's really dealing with some of the very biggest roads, so nothing in specific detail in Leicestershire as yet, apart from the M1 and so forth. And the study basically looked at that to determine, is it worth moving to the next level of study and which areas you would want to study. The study also indicated, as I say, concentrated on 5 areas it introduced as, sorry, skipped over my pages there. In paragraph 20, it highlighted 5 particular areas that needed to be studied further as they gave the most benefit, and one of those was the Leicester area. And one of the reasons why the Leicester area was most picked out, the A46 around the north of Leicester from junction 21 around to the Hobby Horse, and anyone who uses it will know, is the most congested and busiest section. I've got a lot of nodding in the room. The most busy and congested section already on the A46. There is a real lack of resilience in the motorway and the strategic road network in this area, and strategic improvements have already been undertaken at the Hobby Horse Junction and Junction 21 over the years. So the solutions now are starting to have to be very large, so you start looking at very big solutions, one of which could be, as the A46 was built around the north of Leicester, an A46 expressway around the south connecting some way in would give resilience and also extra capacity. That actually then gives the ability, as was been built into the strategic growth plan, for major housing growth around that corridor, and allows Leicestershire to continue to grow economically and with the houses required. I think a key point as well, I know I've had some questions on this in the past, there was also a preliminary environmental risk assessment that was done for the whole of the A46, which was reported in various papers at the time, which started to indicate all of the known environmental constraints that in the corridor. That was across the whole 155 miles. But in Leicestershire, which is what we're interested in, it basically stated, is there anything in this area and as it came into Leicester, around the whole of Junction 21, Oby and Wigston, down to almost Market Harbour, the Foxton Locks, because that was the broad swathe that they were looking at. That may be an impact for further holding back this study if you were looking at other routes or improvements on the line. That's a good thing to do, because you'd want to know what the known knowns was before you started heading into them, so they didn't come and get you later on. So that's what the preliminary environmental risk assessment was about. The study concluded, yes, we need to look at those areas, and now stage 2 is currently being undertaken. And for us in Leicestershire, that looks at not only improving the A46 round on its current route from Junction 21 round for the M69, but round to the Hobby Horse, but also looks at what are the benefits for that southern route. Again, I'll reiterate, that does not mean there's any line on a plan. That merely means modelling and environmental work will be undertaken to see which is the preferred option you go forward with. Is it improving the northern section, or is the most benefit in the southern section? We sit on the group overseeing Midlands Connect in that work, and we are hopeful that will be reporting back. And as I'm sure you'd want here, Chair, a report back on that report when it's done after the summer period. We are assisting, as the Director mentioned earlier, we have one of the probably most far-reaching models, transport models in the country, and Midlands Connect have decided to use our transport model, so it's being extended to put extra links on to show how that route could move around both the north and the south. We've referred to that work in here as well. So we're quite ingrained in the work, and I think it will be really interesting to see what comes back on what started as a very big good idea is now being looked at closely. The stages after this will be, if the case is proven either way on what needs to be done on the A46, as it's such a strategic national project, that would very much have to be taken up by the Department for Transport and the Highways England, because it would go into their future RIS programmes, which are every 5 years, for further study. That's when really detailed study on optioneering on routes, that's when lines on a plan would start appearing, and the Highways England and Department of Transport would start consulting on those. But that is a great deal of work to be undertaken in the future. Thank you.
Okay, I know David was going to bring that up. David, over to you. But I know it's a long meeting, but I do feel that just to add to what Ian said, it is still early days. I know you've got your concerns. I know there was some information regarding, and again, it wasn't true information where it was going to go, the swathe. It was like it was a finite line. So I think we need to. I just feel that it's still early days, but I know you've got concerns. Over to you, David.
Be on record with my concerns that although the route has not been defined across East and South Leicestershire, it is defined in as much as there have been a number of references to Junction 2 of the M69. I've not seen any other southern exit of this road mentioned anywhere, so we can only assume that the reports that appear in here and in the Housing Infrastructure Fund and in the Strategic Growth Plan, all of which referred to Junction 2 of the M69, can be taken as a given, as much as anything can be. And what I have concerns about, and I've had concerns for the last 2 years, is the fact that the combined impact of this A46 expressway, the proposed rail freight depot adjoining Burbage Common, and the Housing Infrastructure Fund plan, which adds to the development already proposed for southwest Leicestershire, in as much as it now shows development which could be housing or industry or a combination of the both, which will be taking up all the space between Burbage, Stony Stanton and Sapcot. The combined impact of all these proposals will change the face of southwest Leicestershire forever. And I do not think that the people of that area have been engaged in the process and are aware of what's happening. Everything is being decided at a much higher level, and all we're reading about in all these reports are all the economic benefits to the country or to the region or even to the county. But what we're not reading about is the impact all this is going to bring, and the need for people to be aware of what's happening. I mean, I could say a lot more, but I think that more or less summarises my concerns, and I just wish to be on record yet again to say that I have the deepest reservations about what is happening, and I don't think that I can personally support any of these schemes until we've actually heard from the people who are affected in the areas that it will impact on.
Thank you, David. And I understand that, and this is, I think, the third or fourth time you've wanted to be put on record your challenging of the particular junction too, and I appreciate that. Anne, would you like to just respond?
Just for clarity, in relation to the E46, as Ian has said, still very early stages. That junction 2 and all the reference to that in whatever guise, be that HIF bids or be that in the National Rail Freight Interchange or be that the E46, etc., is all that does at the moment is reflect opportunity and potential development. If they were to, for whatever reason, if the rail freight interchange was to disappear, there was no other potential development opportunity that could, facilitate that junction or that end of an E46 expressway, that would move, that would go. It is early phases, and therefore with each of these things to come forward, there's statutory processes. As we all know, the NSIP process is happening for the rail freight interchange, and that includes consultation, etc., as any other development in that area would have to go through a local plan and then the planning process. So it's just a reassurance that at the right time there will be those engagements, the right time in the process. We're just not there yet. So that's just to give that reassurance. There certainly will be engagement and people will be aware. And as part of those processes, we have to understand the impact. Through the planning process, particularly in the highways, we have to understand the transport impact and look at the mitigation and if it's feasible to mitigate. So there are these safeguards in place throughout those processes as we go forward. We're still very early days.
Look, thank you, Anne. And I know that it will be brought to this committee again, and this is what Scrutiny is for. We'll keep an eye on it in support of David as well, because I understand his concerns. That's what we're here for. The last thing we want is a monstrosity and changing things too much, and it affects the residents, but at the same time we want progress. Bill?
Chair, Ian said that there's no line been sorted out for the route yet. What worries me is the air quality assessment's been in the report, and it says quite clearly there will be some impact upon Oadby, Bushby and Syston. Well, if they're not sorted the route out, how do they know there's going to be an impact in those areas?
I think it's still a corridor, Bill. Is that right? They're working on the corridor and prevailing winds and things, if I remember some of the reports I've read, that can impact. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. They're looking at what's currently known in the area, and what it determines is if you came too close to Oadby and Wigston, that would become something you'd have to start to mitigate and study. If you came too far south, there are other things with badgers and waterfalls. It lists a large number of knowns already that could possibly impact in the area. So, because Oadby and Wigston's quite near Junction 21 of the motorway.
It also notes listed buildings in the report as well, Chair.
Yeah, sorry, David, fire away.
Pick up a point that Ian made about the environmental impact. On page 126, and these comments are repeated throughout this environmental impact, it says that Burbage Woods and Aston Firs Triple SI is designated because of its presence of woodland. And then further down, talking about the same section, there's a sentence there which I simply do not understand, but it's obviously concerning me. A potential offline Leicester bypass at the M69 Junction 2 could intersect Burbage Wood and Aston Firs Triple SI and 2 areas of ancient woodland. Now we already have the threat of the so-called rail freight depot, and I say so-called because the feeling in the railway industry is that what we're going to end up with there is a massive warehouse complex which might or might not be served by 2 sidings, which might or might not ever be used because there's no actual requirement to actually use them. Therefore, and that is adjoining Burbage Common as well. So there seems to be now 2 threats to the Burbage Wood, Burbage Common area, and I think it's just I feel it's my responsibility, having been involved with that area for nearly 50 years, to raise this and say what something has to be done to protect that area.
Thank you, David. Ian, just your final response.
Yes, as I indicated earlier, what the report does, which it should do, is whenever you're looking at a large area such as this, you list everything that's known that's sensitive. So if you carried on down that list, it also says the route could come near to the Narborough Bog. It could also go all the way down to the Kilby-Foxton Canal. That shows a very wide swathe that they've indicated these are all the areas, such as the Burbage Woods, in this area that are sensitive. And that would inform future thinking on where you were starting to look at this sort of area. So it's that real high-level marker, exactly what you'd want to pin those these are the sensitive things that you really need to know about now when you start thinking about future design in future years. That's all it does.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you, David. I think that completes today's agenda. Point 12, the next meeting will be on the 7th of March 2019. There's no other urgent items. I'd like to thank you for your attendance. It's been a long, but it's first one of the year. A lot to get through. I'd like to thank all the officers, members and cabinet members for attending. Have a safe journey home. The weather isn't very good. It's going to be very cold tonight, so be careful of ice and frost. Good afternoon and see you soon. Thank you.